Grace Sullivan stood frozen on the platform, clutching a letter that had just called her unwanted, when a stranger's small hand slipped into hers, and a child's voice cut through the cold. "Papa, she's crying and nobody's helping her." Before Grace could pull away, a rancher with tired eyes and two identical little girls stepped between her and a town that had already decided she didn't belong. If you're watching this story right now, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because what happens to Grace Sullivan on this ranch is going to break your heart before it heals it. The wind came off the mountains like it had a grudge against anyone still standing on the platform, and Grace Sullivan had been standing there long enough to feel it in her bones. She read the letter one more time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. "We have found another arrangement more suitable for our household. We wish you well." That was all. No name signed with warmth. No apology. Just a folded piece of paper handed to her by a station master who couldn't meet her eyes when he gave it to her. "That's all there was, miss," the station master said, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. "Fella dropped it off yesterday. Said the Whitfield family changed their minds about the position." "Changed their minds," Grace repeated. Her voice didn't shake. She wouldn't let it shake. Not in front of strangers. Not after she'd already cried enough for one lifetime on the 3-day train ride to get here. "Yes, ma'am, I'm real sorry." "You don't need to be sorry. You didn't do anything." Grace folded the letter along its worn crease and tucked it into her coat pocket next to the little money she had left, which wasn't enough to get her anywhere, except maybe a few more nights in a room she couldn't afford. The station master lingered a moment longer, hat in his hands, looking like a man who wanted to say something and didn't have the words for it. Then he mumbled something about needing to check the mail car and walked off, leaving Grace alone on a wooden platform in a town she'd never seen before yesterday. She had crossed nearly the whole width of the country, believing a family in Wyoming territory needed a housekeeper who could also mind children and keep a home running smooth. The letter she'd received back in Ohio had described warm rooms, 3 children who needed steady guidance, and wages fair enough that Grace had allowed herself just once to imagine a life that didn't feel like something she had to apologize for. She had believed it because she needed to believe something. Grace was 27 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that belief was a luxury poor women weren't supposed to indulge in. But she'd indulged anyway. She'd packed her one suitcase, sold what little furniture she owned, and boarded a train with a single hope pressed against her chest like a locket. Now that hope was a piece of paper in her coat pocket, and the sun was starting to dip behind the ridge, and Grace didn't have anywhere to go. She sat down on the bench outside the station because her legs had simply stopped being willing to hold her up, and she stared at the road that led into the town of Cedar Ridge, Montana territory. And she let herself, for exactly 1 minute, feel as small and as forgotten as she actually was. Then she made herself stop. Crying wouldn't buy a room. Crying wouldn't buy supper. Grace Sullivan had never once let herself fall apart in front of people who could use it against her, and she wasn't about to start now, even if the only person watching was a stray dog sniffing around the freight cars. "You'd best move along from there before dark, miss." Grace looked up. The station master had returned, his face still apologetic. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Odom runs it. She's fair if you can pay." "I can pay for a night or 2, Grace said. "After that I don't rightly know." "Well?" The man shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with a problem he had no way to fix. "I'm sorry, miss. Truly." He left again, and this time he didn't come back. Grace was gathering her suitcase, telling herself she would simply walk to the boarding house and figure out the rest of her life over the course of the evening, when she heard the wagon. It rattled up the dirt road with a rhythm that spoke of a driver who wasn't in any particular hurry, pulled by 2 sturdy horses that looked well cared for despite the dust on their coats. Grace didn't pay it much mind at first. Wagons came and went. This was a working town, and working towns had working people, and none of them were her concern. Then she heard the girls. "Papa, look, there's a lady sitting all by herself." "Hannah, get back in the wagon." "But Papa, she's crying." "I am not crying," Grace said, before she could stop herself, straightening her spine and wiping at her face with the back of her glove, even though there was nothing there to wipe. Two identical little girls, maybe 6 years old, were leaning so far over the side of the wagon that Grace half expected one of them to tumble straight out onto the road. They had the same dark hair pulled into matching braids, the same wide brown eyes, and the same expression of a child who had just found something far more interesting than whatever errand they'd been sent to town for. "See, Sarah, I told you," the first girl said. "She's sad." "Hannah Calloway, sit down before you fall out of this wagon and break your fool neck." The man driving the wagon had a voice like gravel worn smooth by a river low, and even the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed, and usually was. He pulled the horses to a stop anyway, which told Grace something about how much authority he actually had over two little girls who clearly did as they pleased. Grace got a better look at him as he set the brake. He was maybe 34, 35 broad through the shoulders, in the way of a man who worked his own land instead of paying someone else to do it. His hat was pulled low, but not so low that Grace couldn't see the exhaustion sitting behind his eyes. An exhaustion that had nothing to do with the day's work and everything to do with something older than that. "Ma'am." He tipped his hat at her, brief and correct. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Grace said, which was a lie, and from the way his eyes flicked to the suitcase beside her and then to her face, she suspected he knew it was a lie too. "Papa asked her why she's sitting here," the second girl, Sarah, said, tugging at his sleeve. "Sarah." "But she doesn't have anywhere to go. Look, she's got a suitcase and everything, and it's almost dark." The man, Grace would learn later, his name was Nathaniel Calloway. Though everyone in Cedar Ridge just called him Nate, looked at Grace with an expression that wasn't pity exactly. Pity was a thing people did from a distance, a thing that cost them nothing. This was closer to recognition, like he was looking at something he understood in a way most people wouldn't. "You waiting on someone, ma'am?" Grace considered lying again. Considered saying she was just resting a moment before continuing on her way, saying anything that would let her keep the last scrap of her dignity intact. But she was tired, and she was cold, and there was something about the way this man asked the question, without any judgment in it, that made her tell the truth instead. "I came here for a position," she said. "Housekeeper for a family called Whitfield. Only they changed their minds before I ever arrived." She held up the letter, then immediately felt foolish for doing it, like she was presenting evidence in a trial nobody had asked her to stand for. "So now I suppose I'm waiting on nothing at all." Whitfield. Nate's jaw tightened at the name just slightly, just enough that Grace noticed it. "Don't know them well?" "Heard the name." "Well, they don't know me at all, apparently, considering they hired me from 3 states away, and then decided against it before I ever got the chance to prove myself." Grace hadn't meant for that much bitterness to come out, but once it started it was hard to stop. "I don't even know what I did wrong. I never met them." "Sometimes it ain't about what you did," Nate said quietly. "Sometimes it's just about what people decide before they ever give you a chance." Something in the way he said it made Grace look at him more carefully. There was history in that sentence. A man didn't talk like that unless he'd lived it himself. "Papa." Hannah had climbed halfway over the wagon's side rail, now ignoring every previous instruction to sit down. "She could come stay with us." "Hannah, that ain't—" "She could help with the house. You said yourself you don't know how to fix Sarah's hair right, and you burned the biscuits again last week, and—" Hannah Rose Calloway. "And she looks nice, Papa. She looks like someone who needs us as much as we need her." The wagon went quiet. Even Sarah, usually the one egging her sister on, had gone, still watching her father's face, with the particular attention of a child who has just said something true and is waiting to see if the adults will be brave enough to admit it. Nate looked at his daughters. Then he looked at Grace, sitting there with her one suitcase and her folded rejection letter, and her spine held so straight it looked like it might snap. "I apologize for my daughter," he said. "She don't have much sense about what's appropriate to say to strangers." "She doesn't need to apologize," Grace said. "She's not wrong that I need somewhere to go. I just don't expect a stranger to solve that for me." "No, ma'am, don't reckon you should." Nate was quiet for a long moment. His hands loose on the reins, his eyes fixed somewhere past Grace on the mountains maybe, or on something further back than that. But my girls lost their mother 2 years ago, and I've been trying to run that house and that ranch both, and I ain't been doing either one of them justice. I need help, real help, not charity and not something temporary that walks off after a week when the work gets hard. I don't walk off from hard work, Grace said, and there was an edge to it now. Something proud rising up in her, despite everything the day had taken out of her. I've never had the luxury of walking off from anything. Nate studied her face for a long moment, the way a man studies a horse he's thinking of buying. Not unkindly, but carefully, like he needed to know what he was getting before he committed to it. I can offer you a room, meals, and fair wages to keep house and help with my girls, he said. It ain't a courtship, and it ain't a promise of anything beyond honest work. You'd have your own room separate from the family quarters. Town might talk. Towns generally do. But my girls need someone, and you need somewhere, and maybe that's reason enough to try it temporary and see how it sits. Temporary, Grace repeated. However long feels right to you. You can leave anytime you've a mind to. Grace looked at the two little girls who were watching her now with matching expressions of hope, so plain and unguarded that it nearly undid the composure she'd fought so hard to keep all afternoon. She looked at the man who had just offered her the only kindness this entire miserable day had produced, offered without asking anything in return, except that she do the work she was already prepared to do. She thought about the boarding house and the money she didn't have and the letter in her pocket that told her exactly how much some people thought she was worth. "All right," she said. "I'll come." Papa said yes. Papa said yes. Hannah was practically bouncing in the wagon bed, and even Sarah allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "I said we'd try it," Nate corrected, though there was something almost like relief in his voice too, buried underneath the gruffness. "Get your suitcase, ma'am. Ride's a fair piece out to the ranch, and I'd like to make it before full dark." As Grace climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him, settling her suitcase at her feet, she caught sight of a man across the street standing outside the mercantile, watching the whole exchange with an expression she couldn't quite place. He was older than Nate, dressed finer than anyone else on that street had a right to be dressed in a town like Cedar Ridge, and there was something in the stillness of him, something patient and calculating, that made the hair on the back of Grace's neck rise, even though she couldn't have said why. "Who's that?" she asked quietly once the wagon had started moving. Nate followed her gaze, and his jaw tightened again the same way it had when she'd mentioned the Whitfield name. "Silas Crandall," he said. "Owns the bank, owns half the land around here that ain't already spoken for, and's been trying to own the other half for longer than I care to think about." He snapped the reins lightly, urging the horses forward. "Best you don't have much to do with him, ma'am. Man like that don't do anything without a reason, and his reasons don't tend to work out favorable for folks like us." Grace looked back once, and Silas Crandall was still watching, his eyes following the wagon until it turned a corner, and he was lost from sight. She told herself it was nothing. Just a man on a street, curious about a stranger. She would learn before very long how wrong that assumption was. The ride out to the Calloway Ranch took the better part of an hour, the road narrowing from town street to dirt track to something that was barely more than two wheel ruts cutting through open grassland. Hannah and Sarah kept up a running commentary the entire way, pointing out landmarks with the enthusiastic authority of children who considered themselves experts on every inch of the territory. "That's Miller's Creek," Hannah announced. "Papa says I can't swim in it till I'm 8. "I'm not scared of it," Sarah added, though nobody had suggested she was. "That's the Petersons' place. They got a dog that bit Tommy Peterson's own brother." "That doesn't sound like a very good dog," Grace said, and both girls laughed like she'd said something enormously clever, and something in Grace's chest, something that had been clenched tight since the moment she read that letter on the platform, loosened just slightly. Nate didn't say much during the ride. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the reins, and Grace found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. There was a stillness to him that reminded her of men she'd known who had buried something and never dug it back up. Men who carried their grief the way other men carried tools, always within reach, always part of the work. "How long's it been?" she asked finally. "Since you lost your wife." His hands tightened slightly on the reins before he answered. 2 years this coming spring. Fever took her quick. Wasn't much anybody could do." "I'm sorry." "Everybody's sorry." He said it without bitterness, just tired fact. "Don't change much. Girls still wake up some nights asking for her. I still reach for her side of the bed some mornings before I remember." He glanced sideways at Grace like he'd surprised himself by saying that much to a woman he'd known less than an hour. "Don't know why I'm telling you that." "Maybe because I'm a stranger," Grace said. "Sometimes it's easier to say true things to someone who doesn't already have an opinion about you." Nate considered that, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone almost before it arrived. Maybe so. The ranch came into view as the last light was draining out of the sky, a modest but solid house with a wide porch, a barn that had clearly seen better maintenance than the house itself, and fences that stretched out toward the darkening horizon in every direction. It wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind of place Grace had imagined when she pictured the Whitfield household with its promised warmth and comfort. But there was something honest about it. Something that had been built by hands, that knew what they were doing, even if those hands hadn't had time lately to keep up with everything that needed doing. "Home," Hannah announced, unnecessary but proud. Inside, Grace understood immediately what Nate had meant about not doing the house justice. It wasn't dirty exactly, but it had the particular disorder of a household run by someone stretched too thin, dishes stacked, instead of washed a basket of mending that had clearly been sitting untouched for weeks, the girls' room with clothes strewn about that spoke of nobody having the time to teach them otherwise. "I know it ain't much to look at," Nate said, setting Grace's suitcase down just inside the door. "Been meaning to get to things, never seem to have the hours." "It's a home with 2 little girls in it, and a man running a ranch by himself," Grace said. "It's not supposed to look like a hotel. Give me a few days and it'll look like a home that's being cared for instead of just survived in." Something shifted in Nate's face at that something that looked almost like gratitude, though he covered it quickly by busying himself with the girls, telling them to wash up for supper, telling them to show Grace where the extra linens were kept. That first night, Grace made a simple supper from what she found in the kitchen, and she sat at the table with a family that had been strangers to her that same morning, and she listened to Hannah chatter about a horse named Buttercup, and Sarah quietly correct her sister's exaggerations, and she watched Nate Calloway's shoulders slowly lose some of their permanent tension as the meal went on. It wasn't the position she had traveled across the country to take. It wasn't the family the letter had promised her. But when Sarah fell asleep with her head against Grace's arm before the meal was even properly finished, and when Nate carried his daughter to bed with a gentleness that told Grace everything she needed to know about the kind of man he actually was, underneath the guardedness, Grace found herself thinking that perhaps being rejected at that station hadn't been the end of anything at all. Perhaps it had simply been the door closing on one thing, so that another door, one she never could have imagined for herself, had the chance to open. She didn't sleep well that first night in the small room off the back of the house that Nate had given her, the sheets still smelling faintly of cedar and unfamiliarity. She lay awake listening to the wind move through the grass outside, thinking about the letter still folded in her coat pocket, thinking about the family that had never wanted her in the first place. She wondered just for a moment what had truly happened. Why a family who had written to her with such warmth, who had described a position so carefully suited to her skills, would suddenly change their mind without a single word of real explanation. It didn't make sense. Not really. But Grace was too tired, too worn down by the day, to chase the thought any further, and eventually sleep took her anyway. She woke the next morning to the sound of Hannah and Sarah arguing in the kitchen, something about who got to feed the chickens, and for one disoriented moment, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, Grace forgot entirely that she had any reason to be sad. That feeling didn't last. It never did, not completely. But over the days that followed, Grace found that the moments where she forgot to grieve her old life came more frequently than she expected, stitched between the moments of hard, honest work that filled her hours from before dawn until well after dark. She learned the rhythm of the house quickly. She scrubbed floors that hadn't been properly scrubbed in longer than she wanted to guess. She reorganized the kitchen so that things made sense, so that a woman working alone in it could move efficiently instead of hunting for what she needed. She mended the basket of clothes that had been waiting for someone's attention, and she taught herself the particular preferences of two little girls who had very strong opinions about how their hair should be braided and exactly how much butter belonged on their biscuits. Hannah warmed to her almost immediately, the way children do who have decided in advance that they like someone. Sarah took longer, watching Grace with a careful, evaluating gaze that reminded Grace uncomfortably of her own childhood, the childhood of a girl who had learned not to trust kindness until it had proven itself over time. "You don't have to like me right away," Grace told her on the third morning when she found Sarah sitting alone on the porch steps instead of joining her sister for breakfast. "I don't expect you to. I'm still new here." Sarah looked up at her brown eyes, older than her 6 years had any right to be. "Mama used to sit here in the mornings, before she got sick." Grace's chest tightened. She sat down carefully beside the girl, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I'm not trying to take her place, Sarah. I couldn't even if I wanted to. I just want to help take care of you and your sister and your papa for as long as that's needed." "Everybody says that." Sarah's voice was small. "The last lady who came to help said that too. She left after 2 weeks. Was she unkind?" "No, she just said it was too much work for what Papa could pay." Sarah picked at a splinter of wood on the porch step. "I stopped trying to like people who help. It's easier when they leave if you never liked them much to begin with." Grace felt something crack open in her chest, some old familiar ache that she recognized because she had carried a version of it herself for most of her life. She understood with sudden and painful clarity exactly what it felt like to protect yourself by refusing to hope. "That's a smart way to protect your heart," Grace said quietly. "I did the same thing for a long time. Still do some days." She paused. "But I'll tell you something true, Sarah. I'm not asking you to like me. I'm just going to be here doing the work every single day whether you like me or not. And maybe one day you'll look up and realize I never left. And maybe that'll mean something to you then. Or maybe it won't. Either way, I'm not going anywhere just because it might take you a while to trust me." Sarah didn't say anything to that, but she didn't get up and walk away either. And when Grace stood to go start the day's chores, Sarah quietly followed her inside, and that Grace decided was progress enough for one morning. The days took on a shape. Morning started before the sun, with chickens to feed, and a stove to light, and 2 little girls to rouse and dress and feed before Nate headed out to the herds. Grace scrubbed and cooked and mended, and slowly watched the house transform from a place that was merely surviving into something that felt lived in, cared for, warm. Nate noticed. He wasn't a man who said much, but Grace began to catch him watching her across the supper table, sometimes an expression on his face she couldn't quite name. Something between gratitude and something else. Something he didn't seem entirely willing to look at directly. "You didn't have to fix the mending basket," he said one evening, nodding at the neat stack of repaired clothing on the sideboard. "I would have gotten to it eventually." "I know I didn't have to," Grace said. "I wanted to. A house runs better when things are where they belong." Margaret used to say something like that. He said his late wife's name carefully, like it still cost him something every time. She had a way of making a room feel settled just by being in it. "I'm not trying to be her," Grace said, echoing what she'd told Sarah days earlier. "I know I'm not her, and I know I couldn't replace what you lost even if I tried. I know that." Nate's eyes met hers, steady and direct, in a way that made something in Grace's stomach turn over unexpectedly. "I ain't looking for a replacement, Grace. Never said I was." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all and busied herself clearing the supper dishes instead, aware of him watching her a moment longer before he pushed back from the table and went to check on the girls. It was on the 5th day that the first real crisis came, small, as it was the kind of thing that revealed more about a person than any calm, ordinary day ever could. Hannah, always the bolder of the 2 girls, had wandered off toward the creek while Grace was hanging laundry, chasing after a barn cat that had taken a sudden interest in exploring the water's edge. Grace didn't notice she was gone until Sarah came running, breathless and pale. "Hannah went to the creek. She said she was going to catch Whiskers before he fell in, and she's not answering when I call her." Grace didn't stop to think. She dropped the laundry where she stood and ran, her skirts bunched in her fists, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She found Hannah at the water's edge, soaked to the knees, reaching for a cat that had climbed onto a half-submerged log just out of her grasp. The current stronger there than it looked, tugging insistently at the girl's small legs. "Hannah, stop reaching, you'll fall in. I almost got him. Hannah Calloway, you get away from that water right now." Grace reached the bank and grabbed the girl by the back of her dress, just as Hannah's foot slipped on the muddy edge, hauling her back with a strength born entirely of panic. Both of them landing hard on the grass, Hannah shrieking half in fright and half in outrage at losing her chance to rescue the cat. "You could have drowned," Grace said, her voice shaking now, all the composure she usually kept so carefully in place, finally cracking under the weight of how close that had been. "Do you understand me? That water is faster than it looks, and if you'd gone in—" "I'm sorry," Hannah said, suddenly. Small, suddenly aware of how frightened Grace actually was. "I just wanted to save Whiskers." Grace pulled the girl into her arms without thinking about it, holding her tight, feeling her own heart still racing. "I know you did. I know, sweetheart. But you have to promise me you never go near that water alone again. Ever. You call for me, or your papa, or your sister, but you don't go in alone. Promise me." "I promise." Hannah's voice was muffled against Grace's shoulder. "Are you gonna tell Papa?" "Yes," Grace said. "Because he needs to know, and because I don't keep secrets that could get you hurt. But I'm not angry at you, Hannah. I was scared. That's different." When Nate came home that evening and heard what had happened, his face went through several expressions in quick succession. Fear, first sharp and immediate. Then something that looked almost like anger, though Grace understood quickly enough that the anger wasn't directed at her. "She could have drowned," he said, his voice tight after the girls had been sent to wash up before supper. "Margaret always said that Creek would be the death of one of them someday. She's fine, Nate. Scared and she'll think twice next time, but she's fine. Because you got to her in time." He looked at Grace, then really looked at her, and whatever he saw seemed to settle something in him. "I don't know what I would have done if—" He stopped, didn't finish the thought, didn't need to. "Thank you, for going after her, for not hesitating." "I wasn't going to stand there and hesitate while a child I'm responsible for was in danger," Grace said simply. "That's not who I am." "No," Nate said slowly, like he was working out a truth for the first time and finding it more significant than he'd expected. "I'm starting to understand that about you." It was a small moment, nothing dramatic on its surface, but Grace felt something shift between them. That evening, some invisible wall lowering just slightly, and she found herself thinking as she lay in bed that night that perhaps she had stopped counting the days until she might leave. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She wasn't sure she wanted to examine it too closely. The town, however, was not nearly as generous in its assessment of the arrangement as the Calloway household had become. Grace felt it the first time she rode into Cedar Ridge with Nate to collect supplies a week and a half into her time at the ranch. The look started subtle women exchanging glances over the tops of their baskets, conversations that dropped to whispers as she passed the mercantile. By the time she reached the counter to pay for flour and thread, the shopkeeper's wife was looking at her with an expression that was polite on the surface and something else entirely underneath. "You're the one staying out at the Calloway place," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I'm working there, yes, housekeeping and helping with the girls." The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line as she counted out Grace's change. "Must be nice. Man loses his wife, and less than 2 years later, there's already a new woman living under his roof." Grace felt her face heat, but she kept her voice level. "I sleep in a separate room, ma'am, and I was hired to do a job. Nothing more." That's what they all say at first. The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You be careful, dear. This town remembers things. And it remembers what happens to women who chase after a man's land and his money by way of his motherless children." Grace wanted to say something sharp in reply, something about how she hadn't chased after anything, how she'd been abandoned at a train station with nowhere else to go. How the very idea of her scheming for Nate Calloway's modest ranch was almost laughable, given everything she'd actually lost to get there. But she held her tongue, because she'd learned a long time ago that defending yourself to people who had already made up their minds rarely accomplished anything, except giving them more to talk about. She gathered her purchases and walked back out to where Nate was waiting with the wagon. And if he noticed the tightness in her jaw, he didn't say anything about it, though. His eyes tracked the shopkeeper's wife with an expression that told Grace he'd probably heard some version of the same talk himself. "Don't let them get under your skin," he said quietly once they were moving again. "Cedar Ridge has always had more opinions than sense." "It's not just their opinions I'm worried about," Grace admitted. "It's what it might mean for you and the girls having a scandal attached to your name because of me." "There's no scandal," Nate said, an edge of frustration in his voice, now though it wasn't aimed at her. "There's a woman doing honest work for honest pay, same as any hand I ever hired for the ranch. Only difference is, folks in this town can't seem to wrap their heads around a woman doing that work without there being some other motive attached to it. Maybe they're not entirely wrong to wonder." Grace said quiet almost to herself, and immediately regretted it when she saw Nate's hands tighten on the reins. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Forget I said it." Grace looked away out at the passing grassland, uncomfortable with how close she'd come to admitting something she hadn't even fully admitted to herself yet. Nate didn't push her on it, though she caught him glancing at her sideways more than once during the rest of the ride home, and neither of them spoke of it again. It was Silas Crandall who Grace noticed watching them as they left the mercantile that day, standing in the doorway of the bank across the street, hat tipped just enough to shade his eyes. His stillness somehow more unsettling than any open hostility could have been. He didn't approach. He didn't speak to them at all. He simply watched with the patient attention of a man cataloging information he intended to use later. And Grace felt that same unease she'd felt on her very first day in Cedar Ridge. The sense that this man's interest in the Calloway family was not idle curiosity, but something closer to calculation. She mentioned it to Nate that evening, once the girls were asleep. "Crandall was watching us today, outside the bank." Nate's expression darkened. "He's been sniffing around my land for the better part of 2 years now. Made me an offer to buy the west pasture not long after Margaret passed, when he figured I might be desperate enough to take bad money for good land. I told him no. He didn't take kindly to that." "What does he want with it?" "Water rights mostly. My land sits over one of the better underground springs in the valley. Crandall's been buying up parcels all around mine, and mine's the one piece that would let him control access to that water for half the county. Man like that don't just want land, he wants leverage, wants folks beholden to him." Nate shook his head. "He's patient, though. Never pushes too hard too fast. Just watches, waits for weakness." Grace thought about the letter in her coat pocket, still there, still unexplained. She thought about how strange it was that a family who had written to her with such specific warmth would change their mind so abruptly, so completely, without ever giving her the chance to even meet them. "Nate," she said slowly. "The family that hired me, the Whitfields. You said you'd heard the name before." "Heard it around is all, don't know them personal." Nate frowned, following the thread of her thinking even before she'd fully articulated it herself. "Why? It just seems strange to me. That letter I got, it was so specific. Details about the children, about the house, about what they needed. And then nothing. No explanation, no apology, nothing except a note left with the station master a full day before I even arrived." Grace pulled the letter from her pocket, unfolding it for what felt like the 100th time. "It's almost like whoever sent this second letter already knew I'd be arriving alone with nowhere to go and no way to get back home." Nate went very still. "You're saying somebody wanted you stranded?" "I'm saying I don't know what to think," Grace admitted. "But it feels less like a family changing their mind and more like somebody wanted to make sure I ended up exactly where I was at exactly that moment with exactly nothing." The room was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the low crackle of the fire and the distant call of some night bird out beyond the porch. Crandall's had his eye on newcomers before. Nate said finally, his voice low. Uses folks who don't know the lay of things yet. Dangles something in front of them, then pulls it away once they're already committed, already stuck, already desperate enough to take whatever's offered next. He looked at Grace, and something in his expression had shifted, hardened the way a man's face changes when a private suspicion suddenly finds a shape he doesn't like. You said the letter offering you the position, it came from Ohio. Yes, addressed and posted from Ohio, same as the family claimed to be from. And the rejection, the one left with the station master here in Cedar Ridge. Different hand. Grace realized aloud, the thought arriving fully formed even as she said it. I never thought to compare them closely before, but now that you mention it, the writing on the second note didn't look anything like the writing on the first. Nate's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on something Grace couldn't see. Some calculation working itself out behind his expression. I ain't got proof of anything, he said slowly. But I got a feeling, and my feelings about Silas Crandall have never once steered me wrong. You think he arranged it, Grace said. That he had something to do with the Whitfield family, or with making sure I ended up here at that station alone? I think, Nate said, that a man who wants leverage over my land might have figured out that a stranded woman with nowhere else to go sitting alone at a train station the same evening my daughters happened to be in town wasn't nearly as much a coincidence as it looked. Grace felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. She thought of Crandall's stillness outside the mercantile. His patient, watchful eyes, the way he'd observed the entire exchange at the station that first evening, without ever once looking surprised by what he was seeing. But why? She asked slowly. Would he want me here at all if his aim was to hurt you? Wouldn't it serve him better if I'd simply gone back home? Nate's eyes met hers, steady and grim. Maybe he didn't count on my girls taking to you the way they did. Maybe he figured you'd end up desperate enough here in town, willing to say or do whatever he needed you to say or do to survive. His voice dropped lower. Or maybe, Grace, he never expected you'd end up out here at my ranch at all. Maybe this wasn't the plan going wrong. Maybe this was the one thing he never saw coming. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, pressing against the windows, carrying with it the particular hush of a Montana night, settling in over land that had already seen more trouble than either of them yet understood. Grace folded the letter and placed it carefully back in her pocket. No longer just a painful reminder of rejection, but something else now. Something with the shape of evidence, the shape of a question that demanded an answer she wasn't yet sure she was prepared to find. Whatever Silas Crandall wanted, whatever game he was playing with a stranger's broken heart and a widower's fragile rebuilding family, Grace understood with sudden and complete clarity that it was only just beginning, and she had no intention of running from it. The morning after that conversation, Grace found Nate already gone before she'd even lit the stove, and when she stepped onto the porch to look for him, she saw him standing at the edge of the west pasture, staring out at land he was no longer certain was safe. She brought him coffee without being asked. "You didn't sleep?" she said. It wasn't a question. Not much. Nate took the cup, wrapped both hands around it, like the warmth of it was the only steady thing he had that morning. Kept turning it over. What you said about the letters, about Crandall. He shook his head slow. If I'm right, then he's been playing a longer game than I ever gave him credit for. And if I'm wrong, I'm a fool jumping at shadows because I don't want to admit I hired a stranger on a whim and started trusting her too fast. Grace felt that last part land somewhere soft and unguarded in her chest, but she kept her voice even. You can trust me and still be careful. Those two things aren't opposites. No, Nate said. Reckon they ain't. He glanced at her sideways. You still got that first letter, the one offering the position? I've got both of them. First one from Ohio and the note left here in town. Then we compare them proper. In daylight, side by side, where I can see what I'm looking at. He drained the coffee and handed the cup back. But first, I got a herd to move before the weather turns, and you got two girls who'll tear the house apart if somebody don't feed them soon. As if summoned by the mention of them, Hannah's voice rang out from the doorway. Grace Sarah says I can't have 2 biscuits, but I can have 2 biscuits, can't I? Papa lets me have 2. Papa does not let you have 2, Nate called back without turning around. He does when you're not looking. Grace bit down on a smile. One biscuit now, and if you eat all your eggs, we'll talk about the second one. That's a yes, Hannah announced to her sister, triumphant, and vanished back inside. You're gonna spoil them, Nate said, but there was no weight behind it. They've had 2 years of nobody spoiling them, Grace said. A little spoiling won't ruin them. Grief already tried its best to do that. Nate looked at her a long moment, something working behind his eyes, and then he simply nodded and walked off toward the barn to saddle his horse, and Grace watched him go, with the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being somewhere she was actually needed. The comparison of the letters happened that evening after supper, after the girls were asleep. Grace laid both papers flat on the kitchen table, and Nate leaned over them holding the lamp close, his brow furrowed. You see it? Grace asked. I see it. Nate's voice was low. First one's got a fine hand, educated, slants right loops careful like somebody who writes a lot of letters and takes pride in them. Second one. He tapped the note left with the station master. Somebody tried to make this look plain, rougher, but look here. He pointed at a single word. The way they crossed their T's, same little hook on the end, both letters. Whoever wrote the second one wrote the first one too. Just dressed it down so it wouldn't match at a glance. Grace's breath caught. So the family that hired me never existed, or if they did, they never wrote you a word of it. Nate straightened up, his face grim in the lamplight. Somebody invented a whole family in Ohio, wrote you a letter warm enough to make you cross the country for it, then wrote you a second letter to cut you loose the minute you arrived. Same hand, same person, start to finish. Why go to all that trouble? Grace pressed her palms flat against the table to steady herself. To strand one woman at a station? It makes no sense, Nate. If someone wanted to hurt you, I'm nobody. I'm nothing to you. I was a total stranger. You were a stranger who happened to be sitting alone at that platform the exact same evening my girls were in town with me. Nate said it slowly, like he was still fitting the pieces together even as he spoke them. That ain't luck, Grace. That's timing. Somebody wanted you and me in the same place at the same hour, with you desperate and me short-handed. The realization settled over both of them like a cold hand. He wanted you to take me in, Grace whispered. He wanted me to take you in, Nate agreed. Question is why? What good does it do Crandall to put a woman in my house? Neither of them had an answer that night. But the question sat between them, and it changed something. Grace had spent nearly 2 weeks believing she was an accident, a stray the Callaways had taken pity on. Now she understood she might be a piece on a board she couldn't yet see the shape of, placed there deliberately by a man whose reasons she didn't know. And that frightened her more than being unwanted ever had. The answer, or the first ugly piece of it, came 4 days later, and it came in the form of a man on horseback riding up the Callaway Drive in the middle of the afternoon. Grace was hanging wash when she saw the rider, and something about him made her set the basket down and move toward the girls who were playing near the barn. Hannah, Sarah, come here to me. Now. Why? Hannah asked, but Sarah, who read tension in adults the way some children read books, was already moving toward Grace, tugging her sister along. The rider was young, maybe 20, dressed like a hired hand, but wearing a pistol at his hip, in a way that suggested he wanted it seen. He drew up short of the porch and looked down at Grace with a lazy, insolent expression. You'd be the woman staying out here, he said. The one from the station. I work here, Grace said, keeping her body between the man and the girls. Mr. Callaway's out with the herd. If you've business with him, you can wait or come back. My business ain't with him. The man's smile was thin. Mr. Crandall sends his regards. Wanted me to pass along that he knows all about your situation. How you came out here with nothing. No family, no references, anybody can check. No one back home who'd even notice if things went bad for you. He let that hang in the air. He thought you ought to know he's a generous man. To folks who help him. And real hard on folks who don't. Grace's heart was pounding, but she'd been threatened by better men than this in worse straits than this, and she'd learned long ago not to let fear show on her face. You can tell Mr. Crandall that I don't know what he thinks I can do for him, and I don't much care to find out. He thinks, The man said that a woman living under Nate Calloway's roof hears things, sees things, papers maybe. Where a man keeps his deed, his water claims his notes from the bank. His eyes flick toward the house. He thinks a smart woman in your position might see the sense in being helpful, and an unhelpful woman might find that a town's already halfway to believing she's a schemer and a homewrecker. Wouldn't take much of a push to finish that story. There it was, the whole shape of it, laid out plain. "Get off this land," Grace said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "You tell your Mr. Crandall that if he wants to know what's inside this house, he can come ask Nate Calloway himself to his face like a man. And you tell him he badly misjudged the kind of woman he was dealing with when he thought he could buy me or scare me into betraying the people who took me in." The man's smile faltered just slightly. He hadn't expected her to be steel. Most people weren't when Crandall's name got spoken with that particular weight behind it. "You'll want to think on it," he said. "Winter's coming. Long, cold winter. Bad time to be a woman with nowhere to go." "I said, get off this land." Sarah's small hand found Grace's skirt and gripped it tight. And maybe it was the sight of the child, or maybe it was that the man had orders that didn't extend to a standoff on the porch. But he tipped his hat with mocking courtesy, wheeled his horse and rode off the way he'd come, leaving a silence behind him that felt worse than his voice had. Grace didn't move until he was well down the drive. Then her knees threatened to give, and she sat down hard on the porch step, pulling both girls against her. "Who was that man?" Hannah asked. "He was mean." "He was," Grace agreed. "But he's gone now. Is he going to come back?" Sarah's voice was small. Grace looked down at the two faces turned up to her, trusting her to have the answer, trusting her to make it safe, and she made a decision in that moment that she could not walk away from these children, no matter what Silas Crandall threatened. "If he comes back," Grace said, "he'll have to go through me first, and I promise you both I am not so easy to get through." She told Nate everything the moment he came home, before he'd even hung up his hat, the words spilling out of her faster than she meant them to. And she watched a fury build in him that she'd never seen before, a cold, controlled anger that was somehow more frightening than any shouting could have been. "He sent a man onto my land," Nate said quietly. "Threatened you in front of my daughters. He wants me to spy on you, Nate. He wants your papers, your deed, your water claims, your banknotes. That's why he arranged all of it. He didn't strand me to hurt you directly. He stranded me so I'd end up desperate and beholden close enough to the family to be useful and poor enough to be bought." Grace's hands were shaking now that the danger had passed and the meaning of it had fully arrived. "He thought I'd be his eyes inside your house." Nate crossed the room, and without quite seeming to decide to do it, took both of her trembling hands in his. It was the first time he'd touched her, and the shock of it stilled them both. "He thought wrong," Nate said. "Didn't he?" "He thought very wrong." Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment neither of them moved his rough hands warm around her cold ones the whole terrible day, narrowing down to that single point of contact. Then Nate seemed to remember himself and let go, stepping back, clearing his throat. "I'll not have you frightened in your own home," he said. "This is your home now, Grace, long as you want it. And no man rides onto Calloway land and threatens the people under my roof without answering for it." "What are you going to do?" "First thing, I'm going to ride into town tomorrow and let Silas Crandall know that his little errand boy delivered his message, and that the answer is no." Nate's jaw set hard. "Second thing, I'm going to find out exactly how deep this goes. Because a man doesn't fake a whole family in Ohio and lure a stranger across the country just to get his hands on one ranch. There's more to this. There's got to be. There was more to it. But it would be a long time yet before either of them understood how much more and how much closer to home the roots of it ran. Nate rode into Cedar Ridge the next morning, and Grace spent the whole day with her stomach in knots, jumping at every sound, keeping the girls close and the doors barred. When he finally came home at dusk, she was on the porch before his horse had fully stopped. "Well," she demanded, "what did he say?" Nate dismounted slow, his face unreadable. "He said he didn't know what I was talking about. Said he'd never sent any man to my ranch, never heard of any woman from any station, and that if I was going around town making accusations against a respected man of business, I'd best have proof, or I'd find myself in front of a judge for slander. Nate hung his hat on the porch hook. He smiled the whole time he said it, Grace. Smiled like he was enjoying himself. He's lying. Course he's lying. But he's careful. Everything he does it clean. No witnesses, no paper, nothing that ties back to him. Nate ran a hand down his face, and Grace saw how tired he was, how much this was already costing him. The man who came out here yesterday threatening you, he works for a fella named Dawes, who does odd jobs for half the ranchers in the county. There's no line from that man back to Crandall that any judge would ever see. He built it that way on purpose, so we have nothing. We have the letters. Nate looked at her. And we have the fact that a whole family in Ohio was invented out of thin air. Somebody wrote those. Somebody paid for the postage. If we can find out who, we can maybe start pulling the thread that leads back to Crandall. He paused. But that's a thing for later. Right now there's a more immediate problem, and it's one I didn't see coming. What? Crandall didn't just deny it. Nate's voice dropped. By the time I left town, half of Cedar Ridge already knew I'd come in shouting accusations at the bank. And the story going around ain't that Crandall threatened my housekeeper. The story going around is that Nate Calloway's gone soft in the head over a strange woman and is making wild claims to defend her honor. He shook his head bitterly. He turned it around on us in a single afternoon, made me look like a lovesick fool, and you look like the woman who put me up to it. Grace felt sick. So now the whole town thinks what he wants them to think. That's how the man works. He don't fight you with fists. He fights you with what people believe. Nate sat down heavily on the porch step. And the worst part is, he ain't entirely wrong about one thing, and he knows it, which is what makes it stick. Grace went still. What thing? Nate didn't answer right away. When he finally looked up at her, there was something raw and unguarded in his face, something he'd clearly been trying not to say. That I care what happens to you. More than a man's supposed to care about a woman he hired 3 weeks ago. He looked away quick, like the admission had cost him. So he's got a true thing to build his lie on top of. And true things make the best lies. Everybody knows that. The silence stretched between them, heavy and full. Grace opened her mouth and found she had no idea what to say, and closed it again. I shouldn't have said that, Nate muttered. Forget I don't. Grace's voice was quiet but firm. Don't take it back. I'm tired of people taking back the true things because they're afraid of them. She sat down beside him on the step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. I care what happens to you too, Nate. And to the girls. More than I meant to when I climbed onto that wagon. So if that's what Crandall's building his lie on, then he built it on solid ground, and there's nothing either of us can do to make it not true. Nate turned to look at her, and for a long moment the whole world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the threat of Crandall, and the whispers of the town, and the long cold winter ahead, all falling away. Then Hannah's voice shattered it from inside the house. Grace Sarah put a frog in my bed. I did not, it was already there. Grace let out a breath that was half laugh, half something else, and stood up. We'll finish this later, she said. Yeah, Nate said softly. We will, but they wouldn't. Not the way either of them meant, because the next blow came before either of them had time to catch their breath, and it came from a direction neither had thought to guard. It started with the school teacher. Grace had been taking the girls into town twice a week for their lessons at the small schoolhouse, a routine she'd established because Nate had confessed the girls had barely set foot in a classroom since their mother died. On the fourth such trip, the schoolteacher, a prim woman named Miss Abernathy, met Grace at the door before the girls could go inside. I'm afraid there's a difficulty, Miss Abernathy said, not quite meeting Grace's eyes. Several of the parents have expressed concern about the arrangement out at the Calloway Ranch. They feel the environment the children are being raised in isn't suitable, and they've asked that the Calloway girls not attend until the situation is resolved. Grace felt heat rise up her neck. The situation being that their father hired a housekeeper. The situation being what people are saying, Miss Sullivan. Miss Abernathy had the grace to look uncomfortable. I don't make these rules, but I have to think of all my students and their parents pay. Their parents pay, and mine can't, so my girls don't learn to read. Grace's voice was tight. That's what you're telling me. I'm sorry. And she did look sorry. But sorry didn't open the door, and sorry didn't let two little girls who had done nothing wrong sit in a classroom with children they'd known their whole lives. Grace looked down at Hannah and Sarah, who were watching this exchange with the dawning wounded understanding of children who realize they're being punished for something they don't understand. Come on, girls, Grace said, keeping her voice steady for their sake. We'll do lessons at home. Truth is, I'm a better teacher than any schoolhouse anyway. But in the wagon on the way home, Sarah started to cry quiet and hopeless, and Hannah, who almost never cried, sat with her jaw clenched hard, trying not to. They said we couldn't come because of you, Sarah said finally. And it wasn't accusatory, just confused, just hurt. Susan Miller said her ma told her that you're a bad woman and we shouldn't play with us anymore. She scrubbed at her eyes. But you're not bad, you're not. And that, more than any threat from Crandall's man, more than any whispered insult in the mercantile, was what nearly broke Grace's resolve. Because she could stand being called a schemer. She could stand the looks and the whispers and the shopkeeper's wife's cruelty. But watching these two children carry the weight of a town's ugliness, watching them be shut out and shamed for the simple crime of loving her, that was almost more than she could bear. She stopped the wagon. She turned to face both girls, and she took each of their hands in hers. Listen to me, she said. Both of you. There are going to be people in this world who decide they don't like you before they've given you any reason. They'll say cruel things and shut doors in your face and make you feel like you did something wrong when you didn't. And it will hurt. It'll hurt every single time. Her voice caught. But you have to remember something. The people who love you, who really love you, they don't need a reason. They just do. And the people who judge you without knowing you, their opinion of you, isn't worth the breath it takes to say it. Do you love us? Hannah asked, blunt as always. Grace didn't hesitate. Yes, I do. Both of you. And I'm not going to let a town full of gossips take you from me, and I'm not going to let anybody make you believe you're less than the fine, brave, good girls you are. Sarah threw her arms around Grace's neck and held on tight, and Hannah, gruff. Hannah, who never cried, pressed her face into Grace's shoulder and let go of the tears she'd been holding, and Grace held both of them there, in the stopped wagon on the road home, and understood fully, and finally, that these were her children now, in every way that mattered, blood or no blood, marriage or no marriage. She just didn't know yet how much it would cost her to keep them. She told Nate about the school that night, and she watched a decision harden in him, the last of his patience burning away. That's the end of it, he said. I've stood by while they talked, stood by while they whispered, but they've gone and hurt my girls now, and I won't have it. Tomorrow, I'm going to that schoolhouse, and I'm going to the families that complained, and I'm going to— You're going to do nothing, Grace said. Nate stared at her. You'd have me just take it. I'd have you not walk into Crandall's trap. Grace stepped close to him. Think Nate. He's counting on this. He's counting on you losing your temper, on you making a scene, on you giving the whole town more proof that you've gone wild over a strange woman. Every time you fight the way he wants you to fight, you hand him another card. She shook her head. We don't beat a man like that by shouting. We beat him with the truth, with those letters, with finding out who wrote them and where the money came from. We beat him by being exactly what he says we're not. Steady, honest, above reproach. So that when the truth finally comes out, the whole town has to look at what we actually did and see there was never anything there but honest work and a family taking care of its own. Nate stared at her for a long moment, the fight slowly draining out of his shoulders, replaced by something almost like wonder. Where'd you learn to think like that? He asked quietly. From a lifetime of people deciding what I was before I could show them, Grace said. You learn a few things being underestimated. You learn patience. You learn that the loudest voice in the room usually loses to the one that just keeps standing there refusing to go away. Nate reached out, then slow, giving her time to step back if she wanted to, and he tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his rough fingers grazing her cheek. "Margaret was the smartest woman I ever knew," he said softly. "I never thought I'd meet another one who could hold a candle to her." His hand lingered. "I was wrong about that too." Grace's breath caught. And for one suspended moment, it seemed like the whole slow, careful thing that had been building between them for weeks might finally break its banks right there. Then a fist pounded on the front door, hard and urgent, and both of them jerked apart. "Calloway!" a voice shouted from outside. "Nate Calloway, you in there?" Nate's face changed instantly, the tenderness gone replaced by the hard readiness of a man expecting trouble. "Stay here," he told Grace. "Keep the girls in their room." He opened the door to find a rider on the porch, a neighbor named Tom Peterson, hat in hand, face grim in the lamplight. "Sorry to come so late, Nate," Peterson said, "but you'll want to hear this from a friend before you hear it any other way. There's papers being filed, down at the county office. Crandall's lawyer put in a claim this afternoon, says there's a defect in your deed, says the original survey of your property was done wrong, and that the west pasture, the one with your spring on it, was never legally yours to begin with." Peterson swallowed. "He's saying it belongs to the county, Nate, and that the county already agreed to sell it to him." The silence that followed was absolute. "That's a lie," Nate said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "My father surveyed that land 40 years ago. That deed's been in my family since before there was a county to file with. I know it. Everybody who knows you knows it." Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "But Crandall's got documents, Nate. Official-looking ones with seals and signatures. And the county clerk's a man who owes Crandall money, and the judge who'd hear any challenge plays cards at Crandall's house every Sunday." He put his hat back on. "I'm just telling you what I heard. Figured you'd want time to get your own papers in order before he moves. Because from what I'm hearing, he means to move fast. Before winter. Before you can rally anybody to your side." Peterson rode off into the dark, and Nate stood in the open doorway for a long moment, not moving, and Grace came up quietly behind him. "Nate, he's not after leverage anymore," Nate said, still staring out into the night. "He's not trying to buy the land or scare me into selling. He's taking it, straight out, with forged papers and a bought judge and a clerk in his pocket." He turned to face her, and his eyes were hollow. "And he timed it so it all lands at once. The town turning on us, the school, the threats, this lawsuit. He didn't do those things separate, Grace. He did them together so that by the time the deed comes up in front of that judge, there won't be a soul in Cedar Ridge willing to stand up and say Nate Calloway's an honest man who deserves his own land." Grace understood then with a clarity that chilled her the full and terrible elegance of what Crandall had built. Every cruelty, every whisper, every closed door had a purpose. He wasn't attacking them in a dozen small ways. He was building a case. A case that Nate Calloway was a man of poor judgment, a man led astray by a scheming woman, a man whose grip on his own affairs and his own land could no longer be trusted. "He put me here for this," Grace whispered. "That's why. That's the whole reason he lured me across the country and stranded me at that station. He knew you'd take me in. He knew what the town would say. He knew I'd become the proof that you'd lost your judgment. I'm not a spy he wanted, Nate. I'm the scandal. I'm the reason. I'm the story he needed to turn everyone against you so he could take your land while nobody would defend you." Her voice broke. "I'm the weapon. He used me. He used me against you, and I walked right into it. I brought this on you. On the girls." "No." Nate took her by the shoulders, firm, forcing her to look at him. "Now you listen to me. You didn't bring anything. You were a woman alone at a train station, betrayed by somebody you never met, doing the only thing you could to survive. If Crandall used you, that's his sin, not yours. And I'll tell you something else." His grip tightened. He made one mistake. One thing he didn't count on. "What?" "He thought putting a strange woman in my house would break this family," Nate said. "Instead, it built one. My girls got a mother again. This house got its heart back. And I got—" He stopped, jaw working. I got a reason to fight harder than I've fought for anything since I buried Margaret. He wanted you to be my weakness, Grace. He turned you into the strongest thing I've got. Oi. Grace stared at him, tears standing in her eyes, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train onto an empty platform, she didn't feel like something to be discarded. She felt like something worth fighting for. Then we fight, she said. Together. All the way to the end. All the way to the end, Nate agreed. But even as they stood there, resolved hands clasped neither of them, yet knew the piece of the puzzle that would change everything. Neither of them knew that the forged survey Crandall had filed contained a name buried in the fine print of its false signatures that Grace Sullivan would recognize the moment she finally laid eyes on it. A name from her own past, from the life she thought she'd left behind in Ohio. A name that would prove once and for all that her arrival in Cedar Ridge had never been an accident at all, and that the man behind everything had a reason to want her specifically, her that ran far deeper and far darker than a single ranch and its spring of clean water. Grace didn't know that yet, but she would, and soon. The name found Grace 3 days later, and it came in the most ordinary way imaginable, which was somehow the cruelest part of it. Nate had ridden to the county office to demand a copy of the filed claim, arguing that as the man whose land was being taken, he had a right to see the papers being used to take it. The clerk, nervous and sweating, had refused at first, but Nate had planted himself at the counter and refused to leave, and eventually, rather than make a scene in front of the other townsfolk conducting business, the clerk had produced a copy just to be rid of him. Nate brought it home and laid it on the kitchen table, and Grace sat down to read it with him, and for the first few minutes it was exactly what they'd expected. Dense legal language, false survey measurements, an official seal that looked real enough to fool anyone who didn't know the land the way Nate did. Then Grace reached the signatures at the bottom, the men who'd supposedly verified the original survey defect, and her whole body went cold. Grace. Nate saw her face change. What is it? She couldn't speak. Her finger was pressed against one name near the bottom of the page, and she was staring at it like it might bite her. Grace, talk to me. What's wrong? This name? Her voice came out strange, distant. This one here? Surveyor of record, it says. Attesting to the original defect. She looked up at Nate, and her face had gone white as bone. Ambrose Sullivan. Nate frowned. Sullivan. That's my father's name, Grace whispered. That's my father's name, Nate. The kitchen went dead silent. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Your father, Nate said slowly. You told me your father was dead. He is dead. He's been dead 6 years. Grace's hands were shaking now, the paper trembling in her grip. He died in Ohio when I was 21. I buried him myself. There's no possible way he signed a survey document for land in Montana Territory that he never once set foot on. She looked up, and understanding was breaking across her face like a terrible dawn. Somebody used his name. Somebody who knew my father, knew he was a surveyor, knew he was dead and couldn't defend himself. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. Somebody who knew me. Nate lowered himself slowly into the chair across from her. You're saying whoever forged this document knew your father personal. My father was a surveyor his whole life. A good one. Careful, honest, respected. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, steadying herself. But he had a partner back before I was born. A business partner. The two of them ran a surveying company together out east before we moved to Ohio. And there was a falling out. A bad one. My father never spoke of it, not once in my whole childhood, but my mother told me before she passed that the partner had cheated my father. Stolen from the company. Left my father to take the blame for debts that weren't his. Ruined his reputation so bad, we had to leave town in the middle of the night when I was still a baby. Her eyes came up to meet Nate's. My father spent the rest of his life rebuilding from nothing. Never trusted a soul in business again. And he never ever spoke that man's name out loud. Said speaking it gave it power. You know the name? My mother told me, once, on her deathbed. Grace swallowed hard. She made me promise to remember it. Said a man like that never stops taking, and that someday he might come looking, and I ought to know his face if he ever did. She closed her eyes. The partner who ruined my father. The man who stole everything and walked away clean. His name was Silas Crandall. The paper slipped from Nate's hand and drifted to the table. "That's not possible," he said. But even as he said it, Grace could see him doing the arithmetic, could see the pieces sliding into terrible alignment behind his eyes. "It's more than possible," Grace said. "It's the whole answer. It's the reason for all of it. Don't you see Nate Crandall didn't pick me by accident? He didn't lure some random stranger across the country to be your scandal. He lured me, Ambrose Sullivan's daughter, because he knew exactly who I was, and he'd been keeping track of me all these years. And when he needed a woman to place in your house, a woman he could use, and then discard, he chose the daughter of the man he'd already destroyed once." Her voice cracked. "He's not just taking your land, Nate. He's finishing what he started 30 years ago. He's destroying the last Sullivan left standing, and he's using me to do it. He's making me the instrument of my own family's ruin all over again." Nate stared at her across the table, and Grace watched him move through the same storm of emotions she'd already weathered: disbelief, then dawning horror, then a fury so deep and cold it seemed to change the temperature of the room. "How long?" Nate said, his voice very controlled. "How long has this man been circling you, circling us? You said your father died 6 years ago. If Crandall's been tracking you since then, longer maybe. My mother said he might come looking someday. She said it like she knew something, like she'd seen him watching even back then." Grace pressed both palms flat against the table to stop her hands from shaking. "I always thought it was just a dying woman's fear, something she imagined at the end. I never once believed it was real." She let out a broken breath. "God, Nate, he's been out there my whole life. A shadow I never knew was following me, and I walked right into the middle of it. I walked off that train and straight into a trap 30 years in the making. No." Nate reached across the table and gripped both her hands, the way he had the night Crandall's man rode onto the ranch. "You didn't walk into anything. You were dragged into it. By a man who's been planning this since before you could even talk. That's not you being foolish, Grace. That's you being the daughter of somebody he hated, born into a war you never chose." His grip tightened. "But you know what that means. It means this ain't just about my land anymore. It never was. This is your fight too, your father's fight. And Crandall just made the mistake of putting the one person who has a reason to burn his whole scheme down right in the middle of his own plan." Grace looked up at him, and something hardened in her chest, some grief transforming itself into something with an edge. "He signed my dead father's name to a forged document," she said quietly. "He used a good honest man who's been in the ground 6 years, a man who never hurt a soul to steal from another good honest man." Her voice grew steadier with every word. "He thinks he can use the Sullivan name to ruin us. He's about to learn that the Sullivan name is the one thing that's going to bring him down." "How?" "Because a forgery is only as good as the lie underneath it." Grace was thinking fast now, the fear burning away into cold, clear purpose. "Crandall signed my father's name to that survey. But my father kept records, Nate. Meticulous records. Every job he ever worked, every survey he ever filed, every day of his life documented in his logbooks, because a surveyor lives and dies by his records. And I have them. I have every one of my father's logbooks packed in a trunk back in Ohio, waiting at a boarding house because I couldn't afford to ship them west when I came." She stood up, energy suddenly coursing through her. "If my father never surveyed a single acre in Montana territory, and he didn't then, his own logbooks will prove it. His whereabouts documented in his own hand for every year of his life, including the year Crandall claims he was out here signing off on a defect in your deed." Nate was on his feet now too. "You're saying your dead father can prove the forgery from the grave?" "I'm saying my father was the most careful record keeper who ever lived, and Crandall forgot that when he decided to use his name." Grace's eyes were bright and fierce. "He thought a dead man couldn't defend himself. He was wrong. My father's been writing his own defense for 40 years without even knowing it. We just have to go get it. Ohio's a long way off, Grace, and winter's near, and Crandall means to have that judge rule on the deed before the first hard snow. Then we don't have any time to waste. Grace was already moving, already thinking through the logistics. I'll write to Mrs. Odom, the woman who runs the boarding house where I stayed. No writing's too slow. We telegraph. We wire the money to have the trunk shipped west by the fastest freight there is. It'll cost more than I have, but I'll pay it. Nate didn't hesitate. Whatever it costs. It's cheaper than losing my land, and it's a sight cheaper than losing. He stopped and didn't finish, but the unfinished words hung there between them all the same. They telegraphed Ohio the very next morning, riding into town together, despite the stairs standing side by side at the telegraph office, while the operator tapped out the urgent message to Mrs. Odom. Ship the trunk. All contents. Fastest freight. Money to follow. And then began the agony of waiting, of counting days against a calendar that seemed to be racing toward winter faster than any freight wagon could hope to travel. But Crandall, it turned out, had eyes and ears in the telegraph office too. Grace realized it 4 days later when the same young hired gun who'd threatened her on the porch came riding up the drive again. Only this time, he didn't stop to make threats. This time, he simply rode past the house. Slow, looked directly at Grace where she stood on the porch, tipped his hat with that same mocking courtesy, and rode on. A message without words. We know what you're doing. We're watching. She told Nate that night, and his face went dark. Crandall knows about the trunk, she said. He knows we telegraphed Ohio. He knows we're trying to prove the forgery. Then he'll try to stop it from arriving. Nate paced the length of the kitchen. A trunk on a freight wagon crossing hundreds of miles of open country. There's a dozen places along that route where a thing could go missing. A wagon could be robbed. A crate could fall off and get lost. Crandall's got money and reach enough to make sure that trunk never sees Montana. Then we have to protect it. How? We don't even know what route it's coming or when. We can't guard a wagon we can't find. Nate stopped pacing and pressed his hands flat against the table, head bowed. He's a step ahead. He's always a step ahead. Every move we make, he's already got a man watching it, and every path we find, he's already got it blocked. Grace watched him standing there, worn down, and she felt the weight of it too, the crushing sense of fighting a man who seemed to control everything. The town, the courts, the very roads that might carry their only hope of salvation. But underneath the fear, something else was rising in her. Something her father had passed down to her, along with his careful, methodical mind. Then we stop trying to outfight him, she said slowly, and we start trying to outthink him. He's watching the freight roads. Fine, let him watch them. Let him think the trunk is coming by freight. She looked up. And we bring the records some other way. Nate raised his head. What other way? I don't need the whole trunk, Nate. I just need the logbooks. The ones covering the years Crandall's forgery claims my father was out here. 3, maybe 4 small volumes. Something that could fit in a single saddlebag. Her mind was racing now. We wire Mrs. Odom again, not to ship the trunk. To pull just those specific books, wrap them small and plain, and send them by a passenger, not a freight. Someone traveling anyway, carrying what looks like nothing more than personal effects. Crandall's men are watching the freight wagons and the crates. They're not going to search every passenger's carpetbag between here and Ohio. Nate stared at her, and slowly the beginnings of hope came back into his tired face. That's a smaller thing to lose in the world, harder to find, harder to stop. And if Crandall's watching the freight roads for a trunk, Grace said, then he's not watching the passenger coaches for a woman with a plain leather satchel. We make him look one way, while the truth comes the other. She allowed herself the smallest, grimmest smile. My father used to say the best way to hide something valuable wasn't to guard it heavy. It was to make it look like it wasn't worth guarding at all. They sent the second telegram the next day, worded carefully, vaguely, in case Crandall's man at the office was reading. And this time when they left, Grace made a show of complaining loudly about the cost of freight shipping, letting the words carry to anyone who might be listening, planting the false trail exactly where she wanted it planted. The days that followed were the longest of Grace's life. She kept the routine of the house going, kept the girls fed and their lessons moving, kept the appearance of a woman simply waiting for a distant trunk. But every night after the girls were asleep, she and Nate sat at the kitchen table and planned and worried and slowly, without ever quite naming it, drew closer together in the particular way that people do when they're standing shoulder to shoulder against something bigger than either of them. It was on one of those nights, maybe 2 weeks into the waiting, that Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, small and solemn, and asked the question that had clearly been building in her for a while. "Are we going to lose the ranch?" Grace and Nate exchanged a look. Neither had wanted the girls to carry this. But Sarah was too sharp, too watchful, to have missed the tension that had settled over the house. "Come here, sweetheart," Grace said, holding out her arm, and Sarah crossed the room and climbed into her lap, though she was really getting too big for it. "There's a man who wants to take some of your papa's land, and he's not being honest about how he's trying to do it. But your papa and we've got a plan to prove the truth. And when the truth comes out, that man's going to be the one in trouble, not us." "But what if the truth doesn't come in time?" Sarah's voice was small. "Hannah says if we lose the ranch, we'll have to go away, and I don't want to go away. This is where Mama is. She's buried under the big tree. If we go away, who's going to visit her?" The question landed like a physical blow. Grace felt Nate go rigid across the table, felt the old grief rise up in him at the mention of his wife's grave, and she understood in that moment that Crandall wasn't just threatening a piece of land. He was threatening to take these children away from the last place their mother still existed for them. "Listen to me, Sarah." Grace turned the girl to face her. "I am going to tell you something, and I need you to believe it all the way down to your bones. We are not going to lose this ranch. Your mama is going to stay right where she is under her tree, and you're going to be able to visit her whenever you want for the rest of your life. Because your papa and I are not going to let anybody take that from you. Do you hear me? Not that man, not this town, not anybody." "You promise." Grace hesitated. It was a dangerous thing to promise a child, something the world might not let you keep. But she looked into Sarah's frightened brown eyes, and she thought about her own childhood, about all the times an adult should have promised her safety, and didn't, and she made the choice. "I promise," she said. "And I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." Sarah studied her face for a long moment, the careful evaluating gaze Grace had come to know the look of a child deciding whether to trust. And then slowly Sarah nodded and rested her head against Grace's shoulder, and the trust in that small gesture nearly undid Grace completely. "I love you," Sarah said sleepily. "You're not like the other lady who left. You're staying." "I'm staying," Grace agreed, holding her close. "I'm staying forever." Over the top of Sarah's head, Grace met Nate's eyes, and what she saw there stopped her breath. Because he was looking at her the way a man looks at something he's afraid to want, something he's afraid to lose. And there was no more hiding from it, not for either of them. He carried Sarah to bed a few minutes later, and when he came back, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, just looking at Grace. "You shouldn't have promised her that," he said quietly. "Not when we don't know how this ends." "I know," Grace said, "but some promises you make anyway, because a child needs to hear them even if the world hasn't decided yet whether it'll let you keep them." She stood up from the table. "And because saying it out loud makes me fight harder to make it true." Nate crossed the room to her. He stopped closer than a hired man, and his housekeeper had any business standing, and he reached up and cupped the side of her face with one rough, calloused hand. "When this started," he said, "I told myself you were just help. Just a woman to keep the house and mind the girls till I could find some other arrangement. I told myself that because it was safe, because I'd already lost one woman I loved, and I swore I'd never let myself be in a position to lose another." His thumb moved gently across her cheekbone. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped believing my own lie. And now here you are promising my daughter forever standing between my family and a man who wants to destroy us all, and I can't pretend anymore, Grace. I can't pretend you're just help. You're not. You're—" The pounding on the door came again. This time it was worse. This time it wasn't a neighbor's warning knock, but a hard official hammering 3 heavy blows and a voice that carried through the wood. "Nathaniel Calloway." This is Sheriff Briggs. Open the door." Nate and Grace sprang apart. Nate's face closed over instantly, the tenderness vanishing into wariness. "Stay back," he told her, and went to the door. Sheriff Briggs stood on the porch with 2 deputies behind him, a paper in his hand, and an expression that said he took no pleasure in what he'd come to do. "Nate," he said, "I'm sorry to come this late, but I've got a court order here signed by Judge Holloway this afternoon. Emergency injunction." He held out the paper, and Nate took it, and Grace watched his face as he read it, watched the color drain out of him. "What is it?" she asked. "Nate, what does it say?" Nate's voice when it came was hollow. "It says that on account of the disputed ownership of the property, and on account of concerns raised about the stability and fitness of the household, the court has ordered that pending resolution of the land claim—" He stopped. His hands were shaking now. "They're taking the girls, Grace. Judge Holloway signed an order to remove Hannah and Sarah from my custody. Says the home environment is unfit. Says with the land dispute and the talk around town about the arrangement out here, the children's welfare is in question." He looked up, and his eyes were wild with a fear Grace had never seen in him before. "They're going to take my daughters." Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her. They can't. They can't just take children from their father. "Judge Holloway can do damn near anything he pleases in this county," Sheriff Briggs said heavily. "And Crandall's got him in his pocket up to the elbow. I know it, you know it, but knowing it don't change the paper." He shifted, clearly miserable. "I got no choice, Nate. The order says the girls are to be placed with a suitable family in town until the matter's resolved. I'm supposed to take them tonight." "No." The word came out of Grace before she'd even decided to speak. She stepped forward past Nate right up to the sheriff, and there was something in her voice that made even the deputies straighten up. "You are not taking those children out of this house tonight. Not into the cold, not away from their father. Not on the word of a corrupt judge doing the bidding of a man who's stealing this family's land. You'll have to arrest me first." "Ma'am, they lost their mother 2 years ago." Grace's voice was shaking, but she didn't stop. "You want to tear them out of the only home they've got left in the dark and hand them to strangers all because Silas Crandall paid a judge to sign a piece of paper? Look at yourself, Sheriff. Look at what you've been sent here to do to 2 little girls who never hurt anybody in their lives." Sheriff Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nate, at the raw terror on the face of a man about to lose the last thing he had. And then he looked down at the paper in his own hand, like it had turned to something foul. "The order says tonight," he said slowly, "but it don't say what hour." He folded the paper and put it back in his coat. "Judge signed it late. Courthouse is closed. Ain't no proper family been arranged to take the girls yet, not really just Crandall's say-so about where they ought to go." He met Nate's eyes. "I could come back tomorrow, midday. Give a man time to file an appeal if he was quick about it, if he had grounds, if he had something real to fight this with." Grace understood what he was offering. So did Nate. "You'd risk that?" Nate asked quietly. "Crossing Crandall." "I got 2 daughters of my own, Nate." The sheriff's voice was rough. "And I didn't pin this star on to tear crying children out of their daddy's house in the middle of the night because a rich man told me to. There's some things a badge ain't worth." He turned to go, then paused. "Midday tomorrow. That's all I can give you. If you got a way to stop this, you best have it ready by then." He mounted up, and he and his deputies rode off into the dark. And Nate stood in the doorway, holding the injunction that would tear his family apart. And for the first time since Grace had known him, this strong, steady, unbreakable man looked utterly and completely lost. "Midday," he whispered. "One day. The logbooks won't be here for another week at best, maybe 2. There's no way. There's no way to stop this by midday tomorrow." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "He's won, Grace. He found the one thing I can't fight. He's going to take my girls, and once they're gone, once the town sees them removed, as proof this house is unfit, no judge in the territory will ever give them back." His voice broke entirely. "I can lose the land. God help me, I could even lose you. But not them. Not my girls. I can't lose my girls." Grace stared at him, at the ruin of him, and something inside her that had been frightened her whole life. Something that had spent 27 years bracing to be discarded finally and completely turned to iron. "You're not going to lose them," she said. "Grace, listen to me." She grabbed his arm. "You said the logbooks are the proof of the forgery, and they are, and they're too far away to help us by tomorrow. But the injunction, the order to take the girls, that's not about the forgery. That's about the household being called unfit. That's about the talk. About me." Her mind was moving faster than it ever had in her life. "And that Nate is a lie we can kill tonight, because there's one thing that would make this household fit in the eyes of any court in the territory. One thing that would take away every last excuse Crandall's given that judge to call this a home children should be removed from." Nate went still. "What are you talking about?" Grace looked up at him, her heart hammering her whole life, narrowing down to the words she was about to say, words she never in her wildest imaginings had thought she'd be the one to speak. "Marry me," she said. "Tonight." Nate didn't answer right away. He stood there in the doorway with the crumpled injunction still in his fist, staring at Grace like she'd spoken in a language he didn't know. "Say that again," he managed. "Marry me, tonight, or as close to tonight as we can make it happen." Grace's words came fast now, tumbling over each other, driven by the deadline pressing down on them both. "Think about it, Nate. The order says the household's unfit. It says a strange woman living under a widower's roof is a scandal, that it's proof you've lost your judgment, that it's no fit place for children. That's the whole excuse Crandall handed the judge. But if I'm not a strange woman anymore, if I'm your wife, then there's no scandal. There's no impropriety. There's just a married couple raising 2 little girls in a proper home. Every single thing they've said about this house being unfit falls apart the moment there's a wedding ring on my hand." Nate set the paper down slowly on the side table. "You'd do that. You'd marry me, to save my girls." "I'd do anything to save those girls," Grace said. "But Nate?" She stopped, and for the first time since she'd blurted it out, the enormity of what she was proposing caught up with her, and her voice dropped softer, more honest. "I'm not offering this only to save them. I want you to understand that. If it were only about the girls, I'd have found some other way. This?" She gestured between the two of them. "I'm not asking you to marry a stranger for convenience. I'm asking you because I've spent 3 weeks in this house falling in love with your daughters, and falling in love with you, and I stopped counting the days until I'd leave a long time ago. Because I don't want to leave. Not ever. Crandall gave us a reason to do this fast. But the reason underneath it, the real one that's been true for a while now." Nate crossed the room to her in 3 steps. He took her face in both his hands, and there was a shine in his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. "You think I don't know that?" His voice was thick. "You think I've been sitting across that supper table from you every night for 3 weeks, watching you braid my daughter's hair and teach them their letters, and stand up to a whole town that wanted you gone and not fallen so far? I can't see the top of the hole anymore." He shook his head. "Grace, I've been in love with you longer than I've been willing to admit it to myself. I told myself it was too soon. Told myself I owed Margaret more than to feel this way about another woman so quick. Told myself 100 things." His thumbs moved across her cheeks. "But the truth is, I'd have married you weeks ago if I thought you'd have me. The only thing that ever stopped me was fear you'd say no." "I'm not saying no," Grace whispered. "I'm the one asking." "Then yes." Nate said it without a breath of hesitation. "Yes, tonight, tomorrow, whenever we can get it done. I'll marry you, Grace Sullivan, not to beat Crandall, not to save the girls, though God knows it'll do that too. I'll marry you because I want to spend whatever years I've got left waking up next to the bravest woman I ever met." For one suspended moment, the injunction and the deadline, and the whole crushing weight of Crandall's scheme fell away, and there was nothing in the world but the two of them standing in that kitchen having finally said the thing they'd both been circling for weeks. Then reality came crashing back. "A wedding needs a preacher," Nate said, stepping back, his mind moving to the practical. "Reverend Whitfield does the marrying in Cedar Ridge, and he's Whitfield. Grace's head snapped up. The name on the letter. The family that was supposed to hire me. Whitfield. Nate went still. Reverend Aldous Whitfield. Been the preacher here going on 10 years. His jaw tightened. I think Crandall didn't just invent a name out of thin air for that letter, Grace said slowly. I think he used a real one, a name that belonged to somebody in his pocket, somebody who'd back up the story if anyone ever asked. Her mind was racing. If the preacher himself is part of this, if he's the one who was supposed to have hired me, then he's not going to marry us. He'll refuse. Or worse, he'll stall until midday tomorrow comes and goes and the girls are gone. Then we don't ask him. Nate was already reaching for his coat. There's a circuit preacher, Reverend Hollis, comes through the county every few weeks. Honest man, no love for Crandall. Last I heard, he was preaching over in Ashford 2 hours ride east. If I leave now, ride hard, I could reach him before dawn, bring him back here by morning. 2 hours there, 2 hours back, plus however long to convince him. Grace was already counting against the clock in her head. That's cutting it close to midday. Too close. It's what we've got. Nate pulled his coat on. You stay here with the girls. Bar the doors. Don't open them for anybody but me, you hear? Not the sheriff, not a neighbor, not anybody. Crandall knows the order came down tonight. He might send men to make sure the girls are taken before we can do anything about it. Grace grabbed his arm before he could go. Nate, if Crandall's man is watching the road, if he sees you riding out hard in the middle of the night, he'll know something's happening. He'll guess. And Crandall will move faster. Nate paused. She was right, and they both knew it. Then I don't take the main road, he said. I cut across the back range through the pass. It's slower, and it's dangerous in the dark, but there's no one watching it. By the time anyone realizes I've left, I'll be halfway to Ashford. He cupped her face one more time, quick, fierce. Keep them safe, Grace. Whatever happens, keep my girls safe. With my life, she said. Go, ride. And then he was gone out into the dark, and Grace heard his horse thunder off toward the back range, and the night swallowed the sound of it, and she was alone in the house, with 2 sleeping children and a court order that would tear them away at noon. She barred every door. She checked every window. And then she sat down at the kitchen table to wait and to think, because Grace Sullivan had never in her life been the kind of woman to simply sit and hope that a man would ride back in time to save everything. If Nate failed, if the preacher wouldn't come, if midday arrived with no marriage, and no proof she needed another card to play, she needed to be ready. She pulled out the 2 letters and the copy of the forged survey, and she spread them all on the table, and she made herself look at them the way her father would have looked at a survey that didn't add up. Carefully, methodically, refusing to see what she expected to see, forcing herself to see only what was actually there. And that was when she found it. The thing they'd both missed. It was on the forged survey at the very bottom below her father's stolen signature in the section attesting to the filing. A date. The date the survey had supposedly been completed and witnessed. And beside it, the name of the witnessing official who'd certified it, a county functionary whose signature made the whole forgery official. The date was March the 12th in the year 1856. Grace stared at it, and a cold electric certainty went through her because she knew that date. She knew it the way you know the shape of your own hand. March the 12th. 1856 was the day her father had been in a courtroom in Columbus, Ohio, testifying in a boundary dispute, because it was also the day her mother had gone into labor and her father had nearly missed the birth of his own child, rushing back from the courthouse. It was family legend told and retold every year. March the 12th, 1856, was the day Grace Sullivan was born. Her father had not been in Montana Territory certifying a survey on the day of her birth. He had been in Ohio in a courtroom and then at his wife's bedside. And there would be records of it. Court records in Columbus, birth records. The testimony he'd given that very day, filed and dated and preserved in a county courthouse 1,000 miles away. Crandall had made a mistake. In his arrogance, in his certainty that a dead man couldn't defend himself, he'd picked a date at random to lend his forgery weight, and he'd landed on the one day in Ambrose Sullivan's entire life that was documented beyond any possibility of dispute in public records in a courthouse that had nothing to do with Silas Crandall and everything to do with the truth. Grace didn't even need the logbooks. She needed a telegram to a courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, requesting certified copies of the court records for March the 12th, 1856. And those records would prove beyond any judge's ability to deny that the survey Crandall had built his entire land claim on was a forgery, because the man whose signature certified it had been 1,100 miles away, welcoming a daughter into the world. She almost laughed. She almost wept. Crandall had used her father's name to try to destroy them, and in doing so, he'd tied his own forgery to the single most documented day of her father's life. The lie carried its own undoing inside it. It always had. They just hadn't looked closely enough to see it. But a telegram to Columbus would take days to answer, and midday was coming, and the girls would be gone long before any certified record could cross the country. The marriage was still the only thing that could stop the injunction in time. The proof of forgery would win the war eventually. But the marriage was the only thing that could win tonight. So Grace held both pieces of it, the sword and the shield, and she waited for dawn, and she prayed that Nate Calloway was riding hard through the dark toward a preacher who would say yes. He came back an hour after sunup, and he wasn't alone. Grace heard the horses and flew to the window. And there he was, Nate, gray-faced and hollow-eyed from a night in the saddle, and beside him on a tired mare rode an older man in a black coat with a Bible in his saddlebag. Reverend Hollis. He'd come. She had the door unbarred and open before they'd even dismounted. "You found him," she said. "You actually found him." Found him and dragged him out of a warm bed to hear the whole sorry story on the ride back. Nate swung down off his horse, and Grace could see how much the night had taken out of him, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Reverend Hollis, this is Grace Sullivan, the woman I aim to marry if you'll do us the honor before this day gets any older." The Reverend climbed down stiffly, studying Grace with shrewd, kindly eyes. "Young man told me a tale on the ride here that curdled my blood," he said. "A rich man forging documents, buying judges, tearing children from their father to steal land, and a woman lured across the country to be made a scapegoat for it." He shook his head. "I've been circuit riding this territory 20 years, miss. I've seen greed do ugly things, but this is about as ugly as they come. If marrying the two of you helps put a stop to it, then I'd count it a privilege, not just a duty." "Then you'll do it. You'll marry us." "I'll marry you." The Reverend's face softened. "Though I'll say this, and I mean it. In 20 years of marrying folks, I've done my share of weddings that were more about property and convenience than about love. This don't feel like one of those, whatever the reasons that made it urgent." He looked between them at the way Nate had unconsciously moved to Grace's side, at the way she'd turned toward him. "This feels like two people who'd have found their way here anyhow, given time. The trouble just took the time away from you is all." Grace felt her throat close. "It did," she said quietly. "It surely did." They woke the girls. Hannah and Sarah came stumbling out of their room in their nightgowns, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and when they saw Grace and their father standing together with a strange preacher in the front room, Sarah, always the quicker to understand, stopped dead. "Are you getting married?" she asked, and her voice was so full of hope it hurt to hear. "We are," Grace said, kneeling down to the girl's level. "Right now this morning, and that means, if you'll have me, I won't just be the lady who takes care of you anymore. I'll be your—" She had to stop and steady herself. "I'll be your stepmother. Part of the family for real, for always. If that's something you want." For a moment, neither girl moved. Then Hannah, blunt, fierce. Hannah launched herself across the room and threw her arms around Grace's neck so hard she nearly knocked her over. "I wanted it since the train station," Hannah declared. "I told Sarah. I said she's gonna be our mama. I said it the very first day, didn't I, Sarah? Didn't I say it?" "You said it," Sarah agreed, and then she was crying, and she crossed the room too slower, and she put her arms around Grace from the other side, and she pressed her face into Grace's shoulder. "You're really staying. You're really gonna be ours. Nobody's gonna take you away." "Nobody," Grace promised, holding both girls' tight, tears streaming down her own face now. "Nobody is ever going to take me away from you, and I'm not going to let anybody take you away from me either. This is what today is about, sweetheart. Today we make it so nobody can ever tear this family apart again." Nate crouched down beside them and gathered all three of them into his arms, his wife-to-be and his daughters. And for a long moment, the four of them just held on to each other in the gray light of that early morning. And it didn't matter that there was no church, no flowers, no proper dress, no guests. It didn't matter that the whole thing had been forced on them by a corrupt judge and a vengeful thief. What mattered was that they were choosing each other, all four of them, freely and completely, in the only window of time they had. Reverend Hollis cleared his throat gently. "I hate to hurry a moment like this one," he said. "But young man tells me you've got until midday, and it's coming on 9 o'clock. We ought to get this done proper and get the paper signed and witnessed so there's no question about it being real and legal when the sheriff comes." So they stood up and they wiped their eyes, and they got married. It was the plainest wedding Cedar Ridge would ever produce. Grace in her ordinary work dress, Nate in the same clothes he'd ridden all night in, the two little girls standing as witnesses in their nightgowns, a circuit preacher reading the vows from a worn Bible in a ranch house front room while the sun climbed toward a deadline. But when Reverend Hollis asked Nate if he took Grace to be his wife, Nate said, "I do," in a voice that shook with everything he'd been holding back for weeks. And when he asked Grace the same, she said, "I do," and meant it down to the ground she stood on. And when the Reverend pronounced them, man and wife, Nate Calloway kissed his bride like a drowning man reaching air, and Hannah cheered, and Sarah cried happy tears. And for one shining moment in the middle of the worst crisis of all their lives, there was nothing but joy in that little house. The Reverend produced the marriage certificate from his saddlebag, filled it out in careful hand, and had them all sign it, the girls too, so that there could be no doubt. Then he signed it himself and dated it and pressed it into Grace's hands. "There," he said, "you're a family now in the eyes of God and the law both. No judge can call this house unfit for having an unwed woman under its roof because there ain't one anymore. There's a wife, a stepmother, a married household raising 2 children proper." He tucked his Bible away. "It won't undo the land claim. That's a bigger fight and a dirtier one. But it'll stop them taking those girls today, and that's worth a hard night's ride to me." "How can we ever thank you?" Grace asked. "You can beat that man," Reverend Hollis said simply. "You can take whatever proof you've got of his forgery, and you can drag it into the light, and you can make sure Silas Crandall answers for what he's done, not just to you, but to your father's memory, and to every honest soul in this county he's ever cheated." He mounted his tired mare. "Do that and you'll have thanked me plenty." He rode off just as the morning was fully breaking, and Grace and Nate stood on the porch watching him go. The marriage certificate in Grace's hands, the girls chattering excitedly behind them, and for a moment they let themselves breathe. "We did it," Grace said. "We beat the injunction. When the sheriff comes at midday, there's no unfit household for him to point to. There's just a family. We beat this one." Nate agreed. He put his arm around her, and it settled there like it belonged. "But you were up all night, same as me. You look like a woman who found something. What is it?" So Grace told him. She told him about the date on the forged survey, March the 12th, 1856, and about what that date meant about her father in a Columbus courtroom, and her mother in labor, and her own birth, documented in public records, 1,100 miles from the land Crandall claimed her father had surveyed that day. Nate listened, and slowly a fierce grin spread across his exhausted face, the first real smile Grace had seen from him in days. "He tied his own noose," Nate breathed. "The one day your father's whereabouts is written down in a public courthouse, and that's the day Crandall picked for his lie. We telegraphed Columbus this morning," Grace said. "Certified copies of the court records and the birth record for that date. It'll take days to come back, but when it does, we won't just have a defense. We'll have proof of forgery, proof that Silas Crandall filed a fraudulent document with the county. That's not a land dispute anymore, Nate. That's a crime. That's the kind of thing that puts a man in front of a judge as a defendant, not a plaintiff. Then that's what we do." Nate pulled her closer. We stopped him taking the girls today, and we're gonna spend the next week bringing the whole thing down on his head." But even as he said it, a rider appeared at the far end of the drive coming fast, and Grace's heart lurched, because it wasn't the sheriff, and it wasn't midday yet, and there was an urgency in the way the horse was being driven that spoke of bad news traveling faster than good. It was Tom Peterson again, the neighbor who'd warned them about the land claim. He hauled his horse to a stop at the porch, and he was breathing hard, and his face was grim. "Nate, thank God you're here." He swung down. "I came quick as I could. There's talk in town this morning, and it ain't good." He glanced at Grace, then back at Nate. "Crandall knows about the wedding." Nate went rigid. "How we only just—" "Reverend Hollis stopped in Ashford to change horses on his way to you last night. Word travels. By this morning, half the county knew the circuit preacher had been called out to the Calloway place in the dark for an emergency marrying." Peterson wiped sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. "And Crandall, he ain't stupid. He figured out in about 2 minutes flat what you were doing and why. That a married household knocks the legs clean out from under his unfit home claim. Then he knows he's lost the injunction," Grace said. "He knows he can't take the girls now." "That's just it, ma'am." Peterson's face was troubled. "He ain't fighting the marriage. He's changed his tune entire. Now he's telling anyone who will listen that the sudden marriage is proof of exactly what he said all along, that you're a schemer who trapped a grieving widower into wedlock to get her hands on his land. That the wedding wasn't about love. It was about a woman securing her claim before the property got taken. He's spinning it, Nate. He's already turned your wedding into more ammunition." He hesitated. "And there's worse. Worse than that." Nate's voice was flat. "He's called a town meeting, tonight at the church, says the community's got a right to hear the truth about the Calloway situation before the land claim goes to the judge. Says he's got new evidence." Peterson swallowed. "Evidence about your new wife, Nate. About her past. About where she really came from and who she really is. He's telling folks that Grace Sullivan ain't who she claims to be, and that tonight he's going to prove it in front of the whole town." The porch went silent. Grace felt Nate's arm tighten around her, felt her own stomach drop. "What does he mean?" she said slowly. "About who I really am. I don't know, ma'am. I only know what he's saying, that there's things about your history you've been hiding. Things that'll change how this whole town sees you and Nate both." Peterson looked genuinely apologetic. "He's real confident about it. And a man like Crandall don't call a public meeting unless he's holding something he thinks'll land hard." After Peterson rode off, Grace and Nate stood on the porch in silence for a long moment. "He's bluffing," Nate said finally. "He's got nothing on you. He's just trying to rattle us, poison the town before the land claim goes up." But Grace wasn't so sure. A cold dread had settled in her stomach because Silas Crandall had known her father, had known her family, had been tracking her by her own reckoning for years, maybe her whole life. And a man who'd kept that close a watch on the Sullivans for 30 years might know things about her past that even she didn't fully understand. Things her mother had hinted at on her deathbed and never fully explained. "Nate," she said quietly, "what if he's not bluffing? What if there's something about my family, about my father? Something my mother never told me the whole of, and Crandall's the only one alive who knows it." Nate turned her to face him. "Then we find out what it is before he can use it. Together. Whatever it is, whatever he thinks he knows, it doesn't change what happened in that front room this morning. You're my wife. Those are our girls. And I don't care what Silas Crandall stands up and says tonight in front of the whole town. There's nothing in your past that could make me love you less or trust you less. You hear me? Nothing." Grace looked up at him, at this man who'd married her in a ridden-through night to save his daughters, who'd said he loved her and meant it, and she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe there was nothing Crandall could reveal that would matter. But as they stood there on the porch, the marriage certificate still in her hand, and a town meeting looming that night, where the man who'd hunted her family for 3 decades promised to expose a truth she didn't even know herself, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the deepest wound Silas Crandall had planned for them hadn't been struck yet. That everything so far, the stranding, the town's cruelty, the land claim, The injunction had all been leading to this. To a room full of people, and a secret about her own blood, and a man who'd waited 30 years to watch the last of the Sullivans destroyed by the truth of where she came from. And she realized with a chill that went to her bones that she was about to learn who she really was at the exact same moment the entire town of Cedar Ridge did. They had until nightfall, and Grace spent every hour of it preparing for a battle she couldn't fully see the shape of yet. The sheriff came at midday as promised, and Grace met him at the door with the marriage certificate held out in front of her before he'd even climbed down from his horse. "Before you say a word," Sheriff read this. Sheriff Briggs took the paper, read it slow, and Grace watched something like relief cross his weathered face. "Married, this morning, Reverend Hollis." He looked up. "By a legitimate ordained preacher signed dated witnessed." "2 witnesses," Grace said. "And the household the court called unfit for having an unwed woman under its roof. That woman's a wife now. There's no impropriety left to remove children over. The grounds for that injunction are gone, Sheriff. There's nothing here but a married couple raising 2 little girls." Briggs folded the certificate and handed it back. "No," he agreed. "There ain't." He glanced past her to where Hannah and Sarah stood watching in the doorway. "I'll take this to Judge Holloway myself. He signed that order on the grounds the home was unfit. Present him a legal marriage, and he's got no legal footing to enforce it, not without making himself look like exactly what he is in front of the whole county." He tipped his hat. "You did a brave thing, ma'am. Both of you. I'm glad I could give you the hours to do it." "There's more coming, Sheriff," Nate said, stepping up beside Grace. "Crandall's called a town meeting tonight. Says he's got evidence against my wife. Says he means to expose her in front of everyone." Briggs's face went hard. "I heard. Whole town's heard." He was quiet a moment. "I'll be there tonight, Nate. Not on Crandall's side. On the side of whatever the truth turns out to be. That's all a man with a badge ought to be on." He mounted up. "Watch yourselves. A cornered man's a dangerous one, and Crandall knows the marriage cost him. He'll be swinging hard tonight to make up for it." He rode off toward town, and the first crisis of the day was survived. The girls were safe. The injunction was dead. But the meeting still loomed, and Grace turned to Nate with a resolve that had been building in her all morning. "I'm not going to that meeting to defend myself," she said. "I've spent my whole life defending myself to people who'd already decided what I was. I'm done with that. Tonight, I'm going to attack. We telegraph Columbus right now. The court records the birth record March 12, 1856. Even if it takes days to come back, sending the request today means there's a paper trail and official inquiry already in motion." Grace's mind was moving fast. "But that's the long game. For tonight, I need something else. I need to understand what Crandall thinks he's holding over me. And there's only one person who might know." She looked at Nate. "My mother's letters. I have them. In my suitcase, the one I carried off that train. She wrote to me the last 2 years of her life, when she was already sick, and some of those letters she made me promise not to read until I was older, until I could understand them. I never did. It hurt too much. I packed them away, and I've carried them for 6 years without opening them." She swallowed. "If there's something about my family, Crandall knows something my mother tried to warn me about. It might be in those letters. And I've been too afraid to look." Nate took her hand. "You don't have to face it alone. Whatever's in them, we read them together." So they did. While the girls napped through the afternoon, Grace and Nate sat at the kitchen table, and Grace opened the bundle of her mother's letters for the first time in 6 years, and her hands shook as she untied the faded ribbon that held them. She read them in order, and for a while they were only what she'd expected, a dying woman's love for her daughter. Memories of Grace's childhood, small instructions about how to go on without her. Grace wept over them, and Nate held her hand, and they kept reading. And then, in the second-to-last letter, dated just weeks before her mother's death, Grace found it. Her mother's handwriting had grown shaky by then, the words harder to form, but the message was clear, and as Grace read it aloud, her voice broke apart piece by piece. "There is a thing I must tell you, my girl, that I have kept from you your whole life, because your father asked me to, and because I was afraid of what it would do to you to know it." Grace's voice trembled. "You believe your father was Ambrose Sullivan, and in every way that ever mattered he was. He raised you. He loved you. He'd have died for you 100 times over. But Ambrose was not the man who fathered you. Before I married your father, there was another man. A man I loved and trusted who promised me marriage and gave me you instead, and then abandoned us both when he learned you were coming. That man was Ambrose's own business partner, the man who later cheated him, ruined him, and drove us from our home. The man whose name your father could never bear to speak." Grace's hand was shaking so hard the letter rattled. "Your true father by blood was Silas Crandall." The kitchen went utterly silent. Grace couldn't breathe. The letter fell from her fingers to the table. Nate had gone completely still beside her, his face a mask of shock. "That's not—" Grace's voice came out as barely a whisper. "That can't be. That can't be true." But even as she said it, everything shifted into a horrible, perfect clarity. Why Crandall had tracked her for 30 years. Why he'd chosen her specifically, her out of everyone in the world, to be the instrument of Nate's ruin. Why her mother had said with such certainty that he might come looking someday, that Grace ought to know his face. It wasn't the vengeance of a man against his old partner's family. It was something far more twisted than that. Grace picked the letter back up with numb fingers and forced herself to keep reading. "I tell you this now at the end, because Silas Crandall is not a man who forgets what he considers his. He abandoned you before you drew breath, but I have always feared that a man like him, a man who must own and control everything, might one day decide he wants to claim what he threw away, not out of love, for he has none, but out of pride, out of the need to possess. If he ever comes for you, Grace, you must understand what he is. He does not want you as a daughter. He wants you as a possession, as proof that everything, even the child he abandoned, belongs to him in the end. Do not let him have you. You are Ambrose Sullivan's daughter in every way that a father is made by love and by choice, and by every single day he showed up for you. Silas Crandall gave you nothing but your existence, and then he tried to take even that. He is not your father. He is only the man who ran." Grace set the letter down. She was crying, but underneath the tears, something else was hardening. Something cold and clear and absolutely unbreakable. "That's why," she said. "That's the whole thing, Nate. That's why he lured me here. That's the evidence he means to reveal tonight." She looked up. "He's going to stand up in front of the whole town and tell them that Grace Calloway, the woman who married Nate Calloway this morning, is his own abandoned daughter, his bastard child. He's going to make my birth into a scandal so filthy that no one in Cedar Ridge will ever be able to look at this family again without seeing shame." Her voice was rising now, not with panic, but with fury. "He'll say I'm illegitimate. He'll say I hid it. He'll paint you as a fool who married a woman with a shameful secret, and he'll use my own blood, the accident of who fathered me, to destroy everything we've built. That's his masterstroke. That's what he's been holding all along." Nate's hands had curled into fists on the table. He'd shame his own daughter in front of a whole town to steal a piece of land. "He'd shame me because I am his daughter," Grace said. "Because I exist as proof that he abandoned a woman and a child, and men like Silas Crandall can't stand proof of their own failures walking around in the world. My mother had it exactly right. He doesn't want me. He wants to own me or destroy me, and he doesn't much care which, so long as in the end I belong to him one way or another." She stood up from the table, and there was steel in her spine now. "But he made a mistake reading that letter to himself before he read it to the town." "What do you mean?" "He thinks the truth of my birth is a weapon he holds over me." Grace's eyes were blazing. "He thinks I'll walk into that meeting terrified of being exposed, that I'll do anything to keep it quiet, that shame will make me weak. He's counting on me being ashamed." She picked up her mother's letter and held it against her chest. "But I'm not ashamed, Nate. I did nothing wrong. A child doesn't choose the man who fathers her. The only person in this whole story who should carry shame is the man who abandoned a pregnant woman and spent 30 years too much a coward to face what he'd done." She looked at him fierce and certain. So I'm not going to walk into that meeting and let him unveil my secret like it's a scandal. I'm going to walk in and tell it myself, loud and proud and first. I'm going to take the weapon out of his hand before he can swing it." Nate rose to his feet and slowly a look of something like awe spread across his face. "You'd stand up in front of the whole town and claim it. Before he can." Silas Crandall spent 30 years believing the truth of my birth was a thing that could shame me into silence, Grace said. "Tonight I'm going to show him that the truth doesn't belong to him. It belongs to me, and I'm going to use it to burn his whole scheme to the ground." They telegraphed Columbus that afternoon, the request for court records and the birth certificate for March the 12th. 1856, sent under Sheriff Briggs's official seal, which he'd offered when he understood what they were chasing. And then, as the sun sank toward the mountains, Grace Calloway put on her only good dress, kissed both girls good night, and left them in the care of Tom Peterson's wife, and rode into Cedar Ridge beside her husband, to face the man who'd fathered and abandoned her in front of the entire town that had spent weeks despising her. The church was full when they arrived. It seemed the whole county had turned out drawn by the promise of scandal, and the murmur that ran through the crowd when Nate and Grace walked in was thick with judgment. Grace felt every eye on her. She kept her chin up and walked to the front, and she did not look away from a single one of them. Silas Crandall stood at the front of the church like a man who owned it, dressed in his finest, radiating the calm confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. Beside him sat Judge Holloway and Reverend Whitfield, and Grace understood at a glance the full architecture of the thing. The judge, the preacher, the banker, all of them arranged together at the front like a tribunal assembled to pass sentence on her. "Mrs. Calloway," Crandall said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, something that made Grace's skin crawl worse than open hatred would have. "I'm glad you came. What I have to say tonight concerns you most of all." "I know exactly what you have to say, Mr. Crandall." Grace's voice rang out clear across the packed church, and she saw the flicker of surprise cross his face. "And I'll save you the trouble of saying it, because I'm going to say it first." The murmur of the crowd died to absolute silence. "Grace." Nate's hand found her arm. "You don't have to. I do." She stepped forward into the open space at the front of the church, and she turned to face the crowd. All of them, the whole town that had judged her, and she spoke in a voice that did not waver. "For weeks now this town has whispered about me. You've called me a schemer, a homewrecker, a woman who came from nowhere to trap a grieving widower. You shut your school doors to 2 little girls who did nothing wrong. You believed the worst of me because a powerful man wanted you to." She swept her gaze across them. "And tonight, Silas Crandall was going to stand up here and tell you a secret about me that he thought would finish the job. So let me tell it to you myself plainly, and let's see if it's the weapon he thinks it is." She turned to look directly at Crandall, and she watched the confidence begin to drain from his face as he realized he'd lost control of his own ambush. 27 years ago in Ohio, a man made a promise of marriage to a young woman he claimed to love. She trusted him, and when she told him she was carrying his child, that man abandoned her. He left her disgraced and alone and pregnant, and he walked away without a backward glance. Grace's voice was steady as stone. "That woman was my mother, and the coward who abandoned her, the man who fathered me and then ran, was Silas Crandall." The church erupted. Gasps, cries, the roar of 100 people all reacting at once. Crandall was on his feet, his face gone purple. "That's a lie! That's a filthy—" "It is not a lie." Grace pulled her mother's letter from her sleeve and held it high. "It is written here in my dying mother's own hand. And you know it's true, Silas, because you've known it for 27 years. It's why you tracked my family across the country. It's why you chose me out of everyone in the world to be the woman you lured to Cedar Ridge with a letter from a family that never existed. You didn't pick a random stranger to be Nate Calloway's scandal. You picked your own abandoned daughter because you're a man who can't stand to see the proof of his own cowardice walking free in the world." Her voice rose over the din. "You wanted to expose me tonight as your bastard child, to shame me and shame this family into ruin. Well, here I am. I'm your daughter, the one you threw away before I was even born. And I am not ashamed of it. The only person in this church who should hang his head tonight is you." The crowd was in chaos now, and Grace saw faces that had judged her weeks ago, now turning toward Crandall with dawning horror and disgust. "She's mad," Crandall said, but his voice had lost its authority, gone thin and desperate. "This is a desperate woman's fabrication. There's no proof of any of this. There's every proof." Grace turned to the judge now. "Judge Holloway, you signed an order this morning to take 2 children from their father based on Silas Crandall's word. Let me give you something you can verify. The land claim Mr. Crandall filed against the Calloway Ranch rests on a survey document. That survey bears the forged signature of a surveyor named Ambrose Sullivan, the man who raised me. It's dated March the 12th, 1856, and it certifies that Ambrose Sullivan personally surveyed Montana Territory land on that date." Grace's voice rang out. "But Ambrose Sullivan was in a courtroom in Columbus, Ohio, on March the 12th, 1856. It's a matter of public record because he testified in a boundary dispute that morning and rushed home that same afternoon for the birth of a child, mine. March the 12th, 1856 is my birthday. It is impossible for Ambrose Sullivan to have signed a survey in Montana on the day I was born 1,100 miles away in Ohio." The judge had gone pale. "We have telegraphed Columbus this very afternoon, under the sheriff's official seal, for certified copies of those court records and my birth certificate." Grace continued, relentless now. "When they arrive, they will prove beyond any question that the survey document Silas Crandall filed with this county is a forgery, a crime, which means the entire land claim is built on fraud, and every action taken because of it, including your order to remove those children, was taken in service of a criminal scheme." She looked at the judge with cold precision. "The question, Judge Holloway, is whether you want to be the man who enforced that scheme knowingly, or the man who did the right thing the moment the truth came to light. Because this whole town is watching you decide." For a long, terrible moment, no one in the church moved. And then Judge Holloway, who had played cards at Silas Crandall's house every Sunday for years, who had signed a corrupt order that very morning, looked around at 100 faces watching him, and made the only choice a man in his position could make to save his own skin. "If what this woman says is true," he said slowly, "and it can be verified by records from Columbus, then the survey is fraudulent, and I cannot in good conscience let the land claim stand." He turned to Crandall, and there was fear in his eyes, now the fear of a man scrambling to get off a sinking ship. "Silas, is any part of what she's saying true? Answer me plainly. Did you forge that document?" Crandall opened his mouth, and in the silence of that packed church, with 100 witnesses waiting, with his own abandoned daughter standing before him, holding her dead mother's letter and the proof of his forgery already crossing the wires from Ohio, Silas Crandall found that he had no answer that could save him. His hesitation lasted only a second, but a second was all it took. The whole town saw it. The whole town understood. "You did," Nate said quietly, stepping up beside Grace, his voice carrying in the stillness. "You forged a dead man's signature. You paid a judge. You invented a family to lure a woman across the country. You turned a whole town against my wife with lies. You tried to take my daughters. And you did it all to steal water rights and to punish the child you abandoned for the crime of still being alive." He shook his head slowly. "You're not a businessman, Crandall. You're a thief and a coward who spent 30 years running from one woman he wronged, and you couldn't even do that with any honor." Sheriff Briggs stepped forward from the back of the church where he'd been standing silent through the whole thing. "Silas Crandall," he said, and his voice was iron, "I'm placing you under arrest. Forgery of a public document. Fraud. And I expect the charges will grow considerable once we get those records back from Columbus and start pulling on all the other threads." He drew closer. "You've owned half the men in this county for years, but you don't own me. And after tonight, I don't reckon you own many of the folks in this room either." Crandall looked around the church at the faces that had feared him and flattered him and done his bidding for years, and he saw in every one of them the same thing: revulsion and the particular cold turning away of people who have just realized the powerful man they served is finished. His empire of debts and favors and quiet threats had held together only so long as no one dared to look at what he truly was. Grace had made them look. And now it was crumbling in real time in front of all of them. "You'll regret this," Crandall said, but the words were empty, the threat of a man who no longer had any power to back it. His eyes found Grace's one last time. "You're my daughter. My blood. You could have had everything I built. I'd have given it to you. All you had to do was what?" Grace stepped toward him, unafraid now, entirely unafraid. "Belong to you. Be your possession, your proof, your property." She shook her head. "You gave me nothing my whole life but the accident of my birth, and then you tried to use even that to destroy me. You want to know the truth? Silas, you're not my father. A man named Ambrose Sullivan was my father. He raised me. He loved me. He worked himself to the bone, rebuilding a life you tried to ruin, and he never once made me feel like anything less than the most precious thing in his world. That's what a father is. Not blood. Not the man who ran." She held his gaze without flinching. "You're nothing to me. You never were. And after tonight, you'll be nothing to anyone." Sheriff Briggs took Silas Crandall by the arm and led him out of that church in front of the entire town, and not one soul stood to defend him, and the man who had ruled Cedar Ridge through fear and debt for a generation walked out a broken thing, undone at last by the daughter he'd thrown away, and the truth he'd never counted on her being brave enough to claim. The records came back from Columbus 9 days later. They proved everything. Ambrose Sullivan's sworn testimony in a Columbus courtroom on March the 12th, 1856. Grace's birth certificate dated the same day in the same city. The land claim collapsed entirely. The forgery charges against Crandall were joined by others, as the sheriff pulled thread after thread, uncovering years of fraud, bribery, and coercion that a whole county had been too frightened to speak of aloud. The judge who'd played cards at his table resigned in disgrace. The clerk who'd taken his money confessed to everything in exchange for leniency. Even Reverend Whitfield, who'd lent his name to the false letter that lured Grace west, was exposed as one more man in Crandall's debt, and the congregation he'd preached to for a decade turned him out. And the town of Cedar Ridge, which had shut its school doors to 2 little girls and whispered cruelty about a woman it didn't know, found itself forced to look squarely at what it had done. The shopkeeper's wife, who'd called Grace a schemer, came to the ranch herself some weeks later and stood on the porch, twisting her hands and stammering out an apology that Grace accepted with more grace than the woman probably deserved. The schoolteacher sent word that Hannah and Sarah were welcome back, and more than welcome, and that she was ashamed she'd ever turned them away. One by one, the people who judged Grace came around, not all of them, and not all at once, but enough that Cedar Ridge slowly became a place the Callaways could call home without flinching. But the truth was, Grace no longer needed the town's approval. She'd stopped needing anyone's approval the night she stood up in that church and claimed her own story before a man could weaponize it against her. Something had changed in her that night, something permanent. For 27 years, she'd lived braced for rejection, certain in her bones that she was a thing people discarded, a woman who had to earn the right to exist in every room she entered. And in one night in front of the whole town, she'd finally understood that the belonging she'd spent her whole life trying to earn had never been something anyone could give her or take away. It was hers. It always had been. Winter came in earnest. A few weeks later, the first hard snow blanketing the valley and the Callaway Ranch settled into a season that for the first time in years held no dread in it. The land was secure. The girls were home. And the house that Nate had once described as merely surviving had become, without anyone quite marking the moment it happened, a home in the fullest sense of the word. It was on one of those snowbound evenings with the girls asleep and the fire burning low that Nate found Grace standing at the window watching the snow come down, and he came and stood beside her, and for a while, neither of them said anything. "You've been quiet since the trial," he said finally. "Ever since it all came out. You want to talk about it?" Grace was quiet a moment longer. "I keep thinking about that woman on the train platform," she said. "The one who stepped off with one suitcase and a letter telling her she wasn't wanted. She was so sure, Nate. So certain that being rejected at that station was the end of everything. That she'd never belong anywhere, never be wanted, that she'd spend her whole life being temporary. Grace turned to face him. And I want to go back and tell her. I want to tell her that the worst day of her life was the day everything actually began. That the family who rejected her was never real, and the man who lured her there meant to destroy her. But that out of all of it, out of the cruelest scheme a wicked man ever devised, she was going to find the only real home she'd ever have. Nate reached out and took her hand. You know what I keep thinking about? What? That first evening, when Hannah leaned over the side of that wagon and said you looked like someone who needed us. He smiled that rare, real smile. 6 years old, and she saw in about 10 seconds what took me weeks to admit, that it wasn't charity taking you in. It wasn't me doing you a kindness. It was you walking into a house that was barely holding itself together and putting the heart back in it. His voice grew rough. Crandall thought he was placing a weapon in my home. He never understood he was giving me the best thing that ever happened to my family. He wanted you to be my ruin, Grace. Instead, you were my saving. Mine and the girls. All of ours. Grace felt the tears come, but they were good tears now, the kind that came from a heart too full rather than too empty. I spent my whole life believing I had to earn the right to be wanted, she said softly. That belonging was something other people decided about me, something I had to be worthy enough to receive. And then I came here, and 2 little girls decided I was theirs before I'd done a single thing to earn it, and you married me in a ridden-through night, and none of it was because I finally became worthy enough. She shook her head. It was just because I walked into your broken home and you all chose me. That's all it ever was. That's all it ever needed to be. Nate drew her against him and she went, and they stood together at the window watching the snow bury the valley in white. You're not temporary, Grace, he murmured into her hair. You never were. You're the permanentest thing in this whole house. She laughed at that, a wet, happy laugh. That's not a word. It is now. I'm making it one. He pulled back just enough to look at her. My daughters needed a mother like you. I said that to myself the first day watching Hannah near tumble out of the wagon reaching for you. But that was only half the truth, and I was too scared to say the rest of it. His hand came up to cup her face the way it had that first night he'd let himself touch her. The truth is, my girls needed a mother like you, and I needed you too. Not because you're useful. Not because you saved the ranch or beat Crandall or gave this house its heart back, though God knows you did all of that. I need you because a life with you in it is the only kind of life I want to live anymore. And I aim to keep needing you every single day for the rest of the years I've got. Grace looked up at the man who'd tipped his hat to a stranger at a train station and ended up giving her the only family she'd ever truly had. She thought of the letter that had called her unwanted folded away now in the bottom of a drawer, a relic of a life she no longer lived. She thought of her mother, who'd tried to warn her, and her father, Ambrose Sullivan, who'd shown her every day what a father truly was. She thought of Hannah and Sarah asleep down the hall, her daughters now in every way that ever mattered, and she understood finally and completely the thing it had taken her whole life to learn. A person does not find belonging because someone at last decides they are worthy of it. A person finds belonging the moment they stop believing they have to earn the right to exist at all. She had walked off that train, believing every door in the world would close against her. She had been wrong. The door that mattered had been standing open the whole time, waiting for her to be brave enough to walk through it. The woman who was rejected at the station became the heart of a ranch, the mother of 2 children who chose her, and the wife of a man who learned to need again. And Silas Crandall, who spent 30 years believing he could own everything, even the daughter he abandoned, died in a territorial prison, having lost it all undone at the last by the one person he'd wronged who refused to be broken. Grace Calloway was never temporary. She was never a thing to be discarded, never a stranger who had to earn her place. She was home. She had always been home. It just took walking into a broken house full of strangers who chose her to finally understand that the belonging she'd chased her whole life had been hers to claim all along. And she never stood alone on an empty platform again.